This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was an avid hiker, always seeking out new trails to explore on my days off. That's how I found myself in the Hammersley Wild area in Pennsylvania one crisp autumn morning. The leaves were just starting to turn, creating a beautiful canopy of reds and golds above me as I made my way along the secluded trail. I'd been hiking for about an hour when I came across a young woman sitting on a fallen log just off the path. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with long dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. As I got closer, I could see she had been crying. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, quickly wiping at her eyes. Yeah, I'm fine," she said unconvincingly. I stopped a few feet away. "Are you sure? It's pretty remote out here. Did you get lost or hurt?" She hesitated before responding. "My boyfriend and I got in a huge fight. He just left me here. Can you believe that? What an asshole." "Wow, that's terrible," I said, truly shocked anyone would do that. "Do you need help getting back to your car?" "That would be great, actually," she said, standing up. "I'm Allie, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Allie. I'm Tom," I replied. "Which way did you come from? I can walk you back." Allie looked uncertain. I'm not really sure. We hiked for a while before the fight. Maybe we should just keep going this way." She gestured down the trail in the direction I had been heading. I was a bit hesitant to continue deeper into the wilderness with a stranger, but I couldn't just leave her out here alone. "Sure, we can do that. There should be a ranger station eventually if we keep following the main trail." As we started walking, I tried to keep up a friendly conversation to help Ali relax. She still seemed on edge, constantly looking around and jumping at small noises. I figured she was just shaken up from the fight with her boyfriend. About 20 minutes into our hike, I started to get an odd feeling in the pit of my stomach. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct sensation we were being watched. I casually glanced around as we walked, trying to spot anything unusual, but the dense forest made it hard to see very far off the trail. "So, Ali, are you from around here?" I asked, hoping to distract myself from the growing unease. "Oh, not really. Just visiting," she replied vaguely. I noticed she kept checking her phone, despite there being no cell service this deep in the woods. Her answers to my questions grew shorter, and she seemed distracted. That's when I saw him, a figure moving through the trees parallel to the trail about 50 yards away. He was dressed like a hiker in boots and cargo pants, but had a dark hood pulled low over his face. My heart started racing as I realized he was definitely following us. I quickened my pace slightly, and Ali matched it without comment. I debated whether to say anything to her about the man I'd seen. I didn't want to scare her if I was just being paranoid. We walked in tense silence for another 10 minutes. I kept stealing glances into the forest, catching glimpses of our shadow every so often. He was definitely staying with us, always just out of clear sight. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I gently grabbed Ali's arm to stop her. "Hey, I don't want to freak you out, but I think someone's following us," I whispered urgently. To my surprise, Ali yanked her arm away angrily. "What are you talking about? There's no one out here but us." "No, I swear I keep seeing a man in the trees. He's been paralleling the trail for at least 20 minutes, I insisted. Ali's demeanor changed completely. Gone was the tearful, scared girl I'd encountered earlier. Now she glared at me with cold eyes. "You're being ridiculous. Let's keep moving." She started walking again at a brisk pace. I hurried to catch up, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? Why wasn't she concerned about a potential threat? That's when it hit me. Ali and the mystery man were working together. This whole thing had been a setup from the start. I felt like an idiot for falling for such an obvious trap. My thoughts were interrupted by a loud crack behind us. I spun around to see the hooded figure step onto the trail about 30 yards back. My blood ran cold as I realized he was holding something that looked suspiciously like a gun. Without thinking, I shoved Ali hard, knocking her off balance, and took off running down the trail as fast as I could. I heard her angry shout behind me, "He's getting away!" Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted headlong through the forest. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding the dirt behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I veered off the trail, hoping to lose them in the thick underbrush. Thorns tore at my clothes and skin as I crashed through bushes and leapt over fallen logs. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but I knew I couldn't stop. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, I finally slowed to a stop. Doubled over and gasping for air, I strained my ears for any sign I was still being chased. The forest was eerily silent except for my ragged breathing. Once I caught my breath, I tried to get my bearings. In my panic, I had run deep into unmarked territory with no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. My phone was useless without service. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I realized I was in serious trouble. I picked a direction that I hoped would eventually intersect with a trail and started walking. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart rate skyrocketing. I kept imagining Ali and her partner emerging from the shadows to finish whatever they had planned. The light was almost gone when I finally stumbled upon a small clearing with a dilapidated cabin. It clearly hadn't been used in years, with boarded-up windows and a partially caved-in roof. But it was shelter, and I was exhausted. I cautiously approached the cabin, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. The old wooden door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Dust motes swirled in the fading sunlight streaming through gaps in the walls. I did a quick sweep of the one-room structure, relieved to find it empty. There was an ancient pot-bellied stove in one corner and the remains of a bed frame against the far wall. I slumped to the floor, my legs finally giving out. As full darkness fell outside, every little noise made me jump. I kept replaying the day's events in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. Who were Ali and that man? What did they want with me? How many other hikers had they lured into their trap? I must have dozed off at some point because I jerked awake to the sound of voices outside. Holding my breath, I crawled to the grimy window and peered out into the moonlit clearing. My blood turned to ice in my veins. Ali and the hooded man were standing at the edge of the trees, scanning the area. They were looking for me. I pressed myself flat against the wall, praying they wouldn't check the cabin. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they would hear it. "He can't have gotten far," I heard Ali say. "Let's circle back toward the river. He probably tried to follow it out." "Fine," the man replied gruffly. "But if we don't find him soon, we're calling it off. Too risky to keep searching in the dark." I waited until their voices faded before letting out the breath I'd been holding. They were gone, at least for now. But I knew I couldn't stay here. They might come back to check the cabin in the morning. I forced my aching body to move, gathering what little energy I had left. Using the moon for guidance, I set off in the opposite direction from where I'd heard Ali and her partner go. The rest of the night passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. I walked for hours, jumping at shadows and straining to hear any signs of pursuit over the normal nighttime forest sounds. Just as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I stumbled out onto a paved road. I could have cried with relief. A few minutes later, a truck driver stopped to help the crazy-looking, bloody guy on the side of the road. I never reported what happened to the police. Who would believe such a wild story? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of those dark eyes in a crowd, or see a hooded figure out of the corner of my eye, and the terror comes rushing back. I don't go hiking anymore. I still remember that day at the dispensary like it was yesterday. It was a typical sunny afternoon in Venice Beach, the kind where you can taste the salt in the air and hear the distant rumble of skateboards on the boardwalk. I'd been working at Green Oasis for about 6 months at that point, and I thought I'd seen it all. The burnt-out surfers, the aging hippies, the tech bros trying to look cool. But nothing could have prepared me for what walked through our door that day. I was restocking the pre-rolls when I heard the bell chime. I glanced up, ready to greet another customer with my usual "Welcome to Green Oasis." But the words died in my throat as soon as I saw him. He was massive. And I don't mean like bodybuilder big or football player big. I mean inhumanly, impossibly huge. He had to duck to get through the doorway, and even then, his shoulders scraped the sides. He must have been close to 7 feet tall, with a build like a grizzly bear. But it wasn't just his size that made my skin crawl. It was everything else. He wore a long, tattered leather coat that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. His face was a road map of scars and burns, barely recognizable as human. And the smell. Oh God, the smell. It hit me like a physical force, the stench of decay and rot, and something I couldn't even identify. As he lumbered into the shop, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. With each step, he left behind a faint, wet footprint. Red footprints. It took my brain a second to process what I was seeing. Blood. He was tracking blood into our store. I glanced at my coworker Jake behind the counter. His face had gone pale, and I could see his hand inching towards the panic button we keep under the register. The giant man stopped in the middle of the shop, his milky eyes scanning the room. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel in a blender. "Happy wants the good stuff," he growled. It took me a moment to realize he was referring to himself in the third person. Happy. The name was so incongruous with his appearance that I almost wanted to laugh, but the fear kept any sound from escaping my throat. Jake, bless him, managed to find his voice. Sure thing, man. What are you looking for, specifically?" Happy's gaze swung towards Jake, and I saw my coworker flinch. "The strongest," Happy rumbled. "Happy needs to forget." I don't know what possessed me in that moment. Maybe it was some misguided attempt at customer service, or maybe my fight or flight response had short-circuited. But I heard myself say, "We've got some new strains in, real potent stuff. Would you like to try a sample?" Happy's head swiveled towards me, and I instantly regretted opening my mouth. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt like I was staring into an abyss. There was something wrong about them, something empty and hungry. "Yes," he said, his lips peeling back to reveal yellowed, broken teeth. "Happy would like that." My hands were shaking so bad I could barely operate the sample jar. I pulled out a small bud of our strongest indica and held it out to him, trying not to recoil as he reached for it. His hand was massive, easily twice the size of mine, and covered in a patchwork of scars and fresh cuts. As he took the sample from me, his fingers brushed against mine, and I had to bite back a scream. His skin was ice cold and wrong. It felt almost rubbery, like touching a corpse. Happy brought the bud to his nose and inhaled deeply. For a moment, his eyes seemed to roll back in his head, and a sound escaped him that was somewhere between a growl and a moan. "Good," he rumbled. "Happy likes this." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Great. We've got plenty more where that came from. Would you like to purchase some?" Happy's eyes snapped back to me, and I immediately regretted my words. His massive frame seemed to loom even larger, and the stench of decay grew stronger. "No money," he growled. "Happy takes what Happy needs." I felt the blood drain from my face. Oh God, we were about to be robbed. I glanced at Jake, silently pleading with him to hit the panic button. But before any of us could move, Happy's demeanor suddenly changed. He straightened up, well, as much as he could in our low-ceilinged shop, and cocked his head to the side, as if listening to something none of us could hear. "Not yet," he muttered, seemingly to himself. "Not time." Then, without warning, he turned and lumbered towards the exit. The bell chimed as he ducked through the door, leaving behind a trail of bloody footprints and that lingering stench of death. For a long moment, Jake and I just stood there, frozen in shock. The entire encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "What? What the fuck was that?" I shook my head, still struggling to process what had just happened. "I don't know, man. I don't know." We closed up shop early that day. Neither of us felt comfortable staying there, not with those bloody footprints still on the floor. We called the cops, but when they arrived, the prints had already faded to nothing. They took our statement, but I could tell they didn't really believe us. Hell, I'm not sure I believed it myself. In the days that followed, I kept expecting to see news reports about a giant scarred man terrorizing Venice Beach. But there was nothing. It was like Happy had simply vanished into thin air. I quit my job at the dispensary a week later. I couldn't shake the feeling that Happy might come back, and I didn't want to be there when he did. I still live in Venice, but I avoid that part of town now. Sometimes when the wind is right, I catch a whiff of that decay smell, and my blood runs cold. I don't know who or what Happy was. Maybe he was just a very sick, very disturbed man. Maybe he was something else. All I know is that I hope I never see him again. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that someday, when the time is right, Happy will be back. And God help us all when that day comes. When the car pulled up, I didn't think much of it at first. The driver was a middle-aged man, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and a scruffy beard. He didn't say anything as I got in, which I found a bit odd, but I was too exhausted to care. I mumbled my address in Queens and settled into the back seat, ready to zone out for the ride home. As we started driving, I noticed the driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. At first I thought maybe he was just checking to make sure I wasn't going to be sick or anything. But the looks kept coming, far more frequently than seemed normal. His eyes would dart up to the mirror, linger for a few unsettling seconds, then back to the road. Over and over again. I tried to ignore it, but I was starting to feel really uneasy. The silence in the car was deafening. Usually Uber drivers at least try to make some small talk, but this guy hadn't said a single word. I pulled out my phone, planning to text my roommate that I was on my way home. To my horror, I realized my phone was almost dead, only 2% battery left. Stupid of me not to charge it at the bar. I quickly sent a message to my roommate before the phone died completely. In Uber, driver acting weird. Track my ride if you can. I hit send just as the screen went black. Great. We were on the highway now, heading towards Queens. But something felt off about the route. I'm pretty familiar with the drive home, and this didn't seem quite right. Were we going further north than we should be? My heart started racing as I realized we were getting close to Rikers Island. Why the hell would we be going anywhere near there? I cleared my throat, working up the courage to say something. Excuse me? I think we might be going the wrong way, I said, my voice shaky. The driver's eyes snapped up to the mirror, locking onto mine. He held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, his expression completely blank. Then, without a word, he abruptly pulled the car over onto the shoulder of the road. We were in the middle of nowhere, some isolated industrial area near the water. I could see the lights of Rikers Island in the distance. There were no other cars around, no buildings, nothing, just darkness. "What's going on?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. "Why are we stopping?" The driver turned around slowly in his seat to face me. His eyes were cold and lifeless. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and emotionless. "Car trouble," he said flatly. "You need to get out." My blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. "What? No, I'm not getting out here. Just take me home, please." He just stared at me, unblinking. "Get out of the car. Now." I was shaking uncontrollably at this point. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I try to fight? Run? I had no idea where I was or which direction to go. And with my dead phone, I had no way to call for help. Before I could decide on a course of action, the driver reached back and roughly grabbed my arm, yanking me towards the door. "I said, get out," he growled. In a panic, I fumbled for the door handle and tumbled out onto the gravel shoulder. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in my ears. To my utter shock, as soon as I was clear of the vehicle, the driver slammed the car into gear and sped off, the engine sounding perfectly fine. I stood there in disbelief, watching the taillights disappear into the darkness. What the actual fuck just happened? The reality of my situation started to sink in. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, with no phone and no idea where I was. And some crazy Uber driver had just essentially tried to kidnap me or worse. I started walking along the shoulder of the road, hoping to find some sign of civilization. But there was nothing but empty lots and abandoned warehouses as far as I could see. The only light came from the moon and the distant glow of Rikers. Every sound made me jump. Was that footsteps behind me? A car engine? My imagination was running wild with horrible scenarios. What if the driver came back? What if there were other predators out here waiting for vulnerable victims? I don't know how long I walked for. It felt like hours. My feet were aching and I was shivering from the cold night air. I was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack when I finally saw lights up ahead, some kind of gas station or convenience store. I practically ran the last few hundred yards. When I burst through the door, the clerk behind the counter looked startled. I must have been quite a sight, disheveled, wild-eyed, and clearly terrified. "Please," I gasped, "I need help. Can I use your phone?" The clerk, bless him, didn't ask questions. He handed over his cell phone and I called 911 with shaking hands. I also managed to reach my roommate, who had been frantically trying to track my ride with no success. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I gave them a statement and description of the driver, but I knew it was unlikely they'd be able to track him down. The officer said they'd had other reports of similar incidents in the area, drivers luring passengers to isolated spots and abandoning them. But this was the first one that had happened so close to Rikers. My roommate came to pick me up, and I've never been so relieved to see a familiar face. On the drive home, I couldn't stop shaking. I kept replaying the night in my head, imagining all the horrible things that could have happened. It's been a few weeks now, and I'm still struggling to make sense of it all. Why did he take me out there? What was his plan? Was he working alone or part of some larger operation? The not knowing is almost worse than what actually happened. I haven't been able to bring myself to use a rideshare app since that night. I'm jumpy and paranoid anytime I'm in a car with a stranger now. I keep wondering if I'll see that driver again someday, those cold, dead eyes staring at me in a rear-view mirror. I know I'm lucky. It could have been so much worse. But the fear and confusion of that night will stay with me forever. I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly sinister, and that there are others out there who weren't as fortunate as I was. So please, be careful out there. Trust your instincts. And maybe think twice before getting into a car with a stranger, even if it seems safe. You never know what might be waiting for you on the other side of that ride. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was working from home while my wife was out running errands. I remember it was unseasonably warm for October, so I had the windows open to let in some fresh air. I was in the middle of a video call when I heard a firm knock at the front door. At first I ignored it, figuring it was probably just a package delivery. But then the knocking became more insistent. I quickly wrapped up my call and went to see who it was. Through the peephole, I saw a guy in what looked like a maintenance uniform. Dark blue shirt with a logo I didn't recognize, khaki pants, tool belt. He was probably in his 40s, average build, nothing particularly memorable about his appearance. I opened the door, keeping the chain on. The guy immediately launched into his spiel. "Hi there. I'm here to take a look at your back door. We've had some reports of issues in the complex, and I need to do an inspection." I was caught off guard and told him we hadn't reported any problems. He insisted it was a routine check of all units. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I told him I'd need to see some ID first. He flashed a badge quickly, but I barely got a glimpse of it. Then he started getting more aggressive, saying he needed to get this done today and couldn't come back later. I was getting increasingly uneasy, but also didn't want to cause issues if this was legit maintenance. Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and let him in. As soon as he stepped inside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had this intense, almost predatory look in his eyes as he scanned the living room. I tried to make small talk to ease the tension, but he barely responded. He made a beeline for the back of the house, not even asking where the door was. I followed closely behind him, my heart racing. When we got to the back door, he started examining it closely, running his hands over the frame and locks. We had multiple deadbolts and a security bar. My wife and I are pretty safety conscious. The guy kept muttering to himself as he inspected everything. Then, without warning, he yanked open the door and stepped outside onto our small patio. I was stunned. I thought he was just here to look at the door, not open it. He stood out there for a few moments, looking around intently, before coming back inside. "All set," he said brusquely. "Make sure you keep this locked up tight." And then he just turned and walked out. Not another word. The whole thing couldn't have taken more than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. As soon as the front door closed behind him, I ran to lock it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. I immediately called my wife to tell her what happened and ask her to come home. Then I called the property management office. That's when things got even weirder. They had no record of any maintenance visits scheduled for our unit or any others that day. They said all their workers carry official ID badges and would never pressure residents to let them in without proper notice. I described the guy to them, and they said he didn't match any of their employees. They told me to call the police, which I did. The cops came and took a report, but said there wasn't much they could do since I had let the guy in voluntarily and nothing was stolen. For the next few weeks, my wife and I were on edge constantly. We added even more locks to the back door. I installed security cameras covering every entrance. We were jumpy at every little noise. I kept replaying the incident in my head, kicking myself for letting him in. The worst part was not knowing what his real purpose was. Was he casing our place for a future break-in, testing our security? Or was it something even more sinister? The fact that he seemed so focused on our door locks and how quickly he could open them still makes my skin crawl. We never saw the guy again or had any break-ins, but I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly avoided something terrible that day. Every time I lock up at night, I wonder if he's out there somewhere, waiting for an opportunity. I know this might sound paranoid, but the experience fundamentally changed how I view home security. I'm hyper-vigilant now about checking IDs, verifying scheduled maintenance, and trusting my gut when something feels off. I still struggle with guilt for putting us at risk by letting a stranger into our home. My wife says I need to forgive myself, that anyone could have made the same mistake. But I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I'd been a little less trusting that day. So I guess the moral of my story is, always verify who you're letting into your home, no matter how official they might seem. And if something feels wrong, listen to that instinct. It's better to seem rude or paranoid than to potentially put yourself in danger. I hope sharing this serves as a warning to others. Stay safe out there, and remember that not everyone who comes knocking has good intentions. I work the night shift at a local factory, which means I'm usually getting home around 3:30 a.m. It's always quiet in my apartment complex at that hour, just the sound of crickets and the occasional car passing by on the main road. I live on the second floor, and I have a small balcony that overlooks the parking lot. That night started like any other. I pulled into my usual spot, grabbed my lunch bag, and headed up the stairs to my apartment. As I was unlocking my door, I heard a strange noise coming from below. It sounded like footsteps, but softer, like someone was trying to be quiet. I paused, key in hand, and listened. The sound stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just an animal or my imagination playing tricks on me. I was exhausted after a long shift, after all. I went inside, tossed my bag on the counter, and headed straight for the shower. The hot water always helps me unwind after work. As I was drying off, I glanced at the clock, 3:40 a.m. I decided to have a quick smoke on the balcony before bed, as I often do. I stepped out onto the balcony, cigarette in hand, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing in the shadows near the edge of the parking lot, partially hidden behind a tree. He was wearing black sweatpants and a camouflage jacket. Even from a distance, I could tell he was staring directly at me. My heart started racing. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I run inside? Call for help? I stood there, paralyzed, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without thinking, I flicked on the balcony light. The sudden brightness illuminated the entire area, including the man. He didn't flinch or try to hide. Instead, he calmly turned and started walking towards the main road. As he reached the edge of the parking lot, he stopped and looked back at me one last time. Even from that distance, I could feel the intensity of his gaze. It sent chills down my spine. Then he disappeared into the darkness. I rushed inside, locked the door, and closed all the curtains. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. When the operator answered, I tried to explain what had happened, but I was so panicked I could hardly get the words out. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. By then, the man was long gone. I told them everything I could remember: his clothes, his calm demeanor, the way he looked at me. But they didn't seem too concerned. "Ma'am, it's not illegal for someone to be walking around at night," one of the officers said. "Did he threaten you or try to break in?" "No, but then there's not much we can do. He's probably just some guy out for a late-night walk. Try not to worry about it." They left after taking a brief statement, leaving me feeling dismissed and even more vulnerable than before. How could they not see how terrifying this was? Didn't they understand that normal people don't lurk in parking lots at 3:40 in the morning, staring at women's apartments? I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face looking up at me. I kept imagining him climbing up to my balcony, breaking through the glass door. I checked the locks over and over again. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I called my landlord and begged him to install better security lighting and cameras. I bought pepper spray and a baseball bat. I started pushing my heavy dresser in front of the balcony door every night. But it wasn't enough. I felt like I was losing my mind. Every shadow, every noise made me jump. I couldn't focus at work. I started calling in sick more often, afraid to leave my apartment at night. I became obsessed with security. I installed multiple locks on my doors and windows. I put alarm sensors on every possible entry point. I started sleeping with the lights on, afraid of what might be lurking in the darkness. My friends and family tried to help, but they didn't understand. They told me I was overreacting, that it was probably nothing. But they hadn't seen the look in that man's eyes. They hadn't felt the terror of being watched in your own home. Weeks turned into months, and the man never reappeared. But the fear never went away. I still check the parking lot obsessively before I leave for work. I still can't sleep without the lights on. I've developed a routine of checking and rechecking locks and alarms multiple times a day. I know it sounds crazy. I know I should be over it by now. But I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching and waiting. Every time I step onto that balcony, I half expect to see him standing there in the shadows. The worst part is the not knowing. Who was he? What did he want? Was he just a random creep, or was he targeting me specifically? I'll probably never know the answers, and that uncertainty is eating me alive. I've thought about moving, but the idea of packing up and starting over somewhere new is overwhelming. Plus, who's to say it won't happen again in a new place? At least here, I know what to watch out for. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Maybe the police were right, and it was just some harmless guy out for a walk. But then I remember the way he looked at me, the deliberate way he moved, and I know in my gut that it was something more sinister. I've tried therapy, but it's hard to explain to someone who wasn't there. They always want to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation. But there is no logical explanation for the terror I felt that night, or for the way it's completely changed my life. I used to love my job, loved the quiet solitude of the night shift. Now, every moment in the dark feels like a threat. I jump at every sound. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. I've become a prisoner in my own home, afraid to enjoy my balcony or even open the curtains at night. The rational part of my brain knows that I can't live like this forever. I need to find a way to move on, to reclaim my life. But every time I try to relax my vigilance even a little, the fear comes rushing back. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has been through something similar and can tell me it gets better. Or maybe I just needed to get it off my chest, to put into words the nightmare I've been living for the past few months. All I know is that one brief encounter on a quiet night has completely shattered my sense of safety and normalcy. I keep waiting for things to go back to normal, for the fear to fade, but I'm starting to realize that maybe this is my new normal, and I don't know how to live with that. So here I am, still jumping at shadows, still checking locks, still afraid to close my eyes at night. All because of a stranger in the parking lot, a fleeting moment that's become the defining experience of my life. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. And that, more than anything, is what terrifies me the most. It was a typically boring Saturday afternoon in our small town. My 10-year-old sister Emma was pestering me to take her somewhere fun. I finally gave in, figuring we could walk around downtown and window shop for a bit. As we strolled down Main Street, we came across an old toy store I'd never noticed before. The faded sign read, "Toyland Treasures," and the dusty windows were filled with vintage dolls and toy cars. Emma's eyes lit up and she begged to go inside. I was hesitant. The place looked pretty run down and creepy, but she kept pleading, so I reluctantly agreed. The bell above the door jingled as we entered, and I was immediately hit by the musty smell of old cardboard and plastic. The interior was dimly lit and packed floor to ceiling with shelves of toys. It was like stepping back in time. There were no modern toys or electronics, just old-fashioned dolls, board games, and mechanical wind-up toys. Emma wandered off to look at a display of stuffed animals while I browsed the board games. I was examining a dusty Monopoly box when I heard a quiet cough behind me. I turned to see an old man standing there, his wrinkled face peering at me from beneath a grimy baseball cap. He must have been the shopkeeper, though I hadn't seen anyone when we first entered. "Can I help you find anything?" he asked in a raspy voice. I was just looking," I replied, feeling uneasy. "Do you have any jigsaw puzzles?" A strange smile crept across his face. "Ah, yes, puzzles. We keep those downstairs in the basement. Much larger selection down there." He shuffled over to a far corner of the shop and pointed to a small door I hadn't noticed before. It was partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, painted the same faded blue as the wall. "Right through there," he said. "Watch your step on the stairs." I peered at the door skeptically. It looked ancient, with peeling paint and rusted hinges. "Oh, that's okay," I said quickly. "We don't really need—" But the old man had already grasped the doorknob and was turning it with a loud creak. The door swung open to reveal a set of narrow wooden stairs descending steeply into darkness. A dank, moldy smell wafted up from below. My heart started racing as I stared into that black void. Every instinct was screaming at me not to go down there. I had a vivid mental image of the door slamming shut behind me, trapping me in some nightmarish dungeon. I think we should be going," I stammered, backing away. "Emma, time to leave." The old man's smile never wavered. "Are you sure? There are some real treasures down there. Why don't you take a look?" I shook my head frantically. "No, that's okay. We really need to get home for dinner." Emma came bounding over, arms full of stuffed animals. "Ah, do we have to go already?" "Yes," I said firmly, grabbing her hand. "Now." I practically dragged her out of the store, ignoring her protests. As soon as we were outside, I broke into a run, pulling Emma along behind me. We didn't stop until we were several blocks away. "What's wrong?" Emma asked out of breath. Why'd we have to leave so fast? I tried to calm my racing heart. I just had a bad feeling about that place, I said. Did you see that creepy basement door? Emma shook her head. No, I was looking at the toys. Can we go back tomorrow? Absolutely not, I said. We're never going in that store again. For days afterward, I was jumpy and on edge. I kept replaying the incident in my mind, imagining what horrors might have awaited us in that basement. The image of those dark stairs haunted my dreams. About a week later, I decided to do some research on the toy store. I couldn't find any official business listing for Toyland Treasures. When I checked Google Maps, the storefront wasn't even there, just an empty lot between two other buildings. Thoroughly freaked out, I convinced my mom to drive me downtown so I could show her. But when we got to Main Street, the toy store was gone. The space between the buildings was just a narrow alley filled with trash cans. There was no sign that a store had ever been there at all. I tried to tell myself that I must have been mistaken about the location, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. That store had been real, and so was the danger I'd sensed. To this day, I still get chills thinking about what might have happened if I'd gone down those stairs. I'm grateful that I trusted my instincts and got out of there when I did. But part of me wonders if that sinister toy store is still out there somewhere, luring in unsuspecting victims with the promise of hidden treasures. I've never told anyone else this story before now. Even typing it out, I worry that people will think I'm crazy or making it up. But I know what I experienced was real. So if you're ever exploring an unfamiliar town and come across a quaint little toy store that seems too good to be true, trust your gut and stay far, far away from the basement. From day one, something felt off about Mark. He had this intense stare that made me uncomfortable, like he was undressing me with his eyes. I tried to brush it off at first. Maybe I was just being paranoid or reading too much into things. But as the days went on, his behavior got more and more inappropriate. It started with accidental touches, brushing up against me when walking by, standing way too close when looking at my computer screen. I'd try to create distance, but he always found a way to invade my personal space. Then came the lewd gestures and mouthing of words I'm pretty sure were sexual in nature. I couldn't prove anything concrete, but my skin crawled every time he was near. I started dreading coming into work. My stomach would be in knots on the elevator ride up, knowing I'd have to deal with Mark's creepy behavior all day. I tried to avoid being alone with him, always making sure there were others around. But he seemed to have a sixth sense for cornering me when no one else was looking. One day, I was walking down the hallway to the break room when Mark suddenly appeared in front of me, blocking my path. He had this smug grin on his face as he deliberately stood in my way, not letting me pass. I tried to sidestep around him, but he matched my movements. My heart was racing as I realized how much bigger and stronger he was than me. After what felt like an eternity, he finally let me pass, laughing silently to himself as I rushed by. I knew I needed to say something, but I was scared. Mark had a reputation for being a good worker, and I worried people wouldn't believe me or would think I was discriminating against him because of his disability. So I kept quiet and tried to deal with it on my own. Things came to a head about a month ago. We were having a team meeting, and Mark kept ignoring the manager's instructions, doing his own thing instead. When called out on it, he'd play dumb or act like he misunderstood. It was clear he was using his deafness as an excuse to be disruptive. After the meeting, I overheard him making crude sexual comments about our manager to another male co-worker. They were using sign language, but I knew enough to catch the gist of what was being said. It made me sick to my stomach. That same afternoon, I was at the copy machine when I saw Mark approach Jessica, a new intern. Before I could react, he reached out and groped her breast, grinning lecherously. Jessica jumped back, looking stunned and violated. Mark just shrugged innocently, as if to say, "Oops, didn't mean to." I'd had enough. Shaking with anger and adrenaline, I marched straight to HR and reported everything I'd witnessed and experienced. To their credit, they took it seriously and launched an immediate investigation. They interviewed several other women who came forward with similar stories of harassment. Within days, Mark was called into a meeting with HR and upper management. I don't know exactly what was said, but I could hear shouting from down the hall. Suddenly the door burst open and Mark came storming out, his face red with rage. He started gesticulating wildly, mouthing words I couldn't understand. Security had to escort him from the building. We later learned he'd been fired for multiple violations of the company's harassment policies. Part of me felt relieved, but another part was terrified. The look of pure hatred he'd given me as he was led out made my blood run cold. I worried he might try to retaliate somehow. For weeks after, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, both at work and on my commute home. Every time I saw someone who looked like Mark out of the corner of my eye, my heart would start racing. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of him breaking into my apartment. It's been a month now, and things are slowly getting back to normal at work. There's a new awareness about harassment issues, and management has implemented additional training and reporting procedures. Jessica decided not to pursue legal action, but she's in therapy to deal with the trauma. As for me, I'm still processing everything that happened. I feel angry that it was allowed to go on for so long, guilty that I didn't speak up sooner, and sad that someone I initially wanted to support turned out to be such a predator. But mostly, I feel proud that I finally found the courage to stand up and say something. I know there are probably other women out there dealing with similar situations, afraid to come forward. I want them to know they're not alone, and that it's okay to speak up. No one should have to endure harassment or abuse in the workplace, regardless of the perpetrator's status or disability. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I ignored or explained away. I've learned to trust my instincts and not be afraid to report inappropriate behavior, even if it might be uncomfortable or controversial. Our safety and dignity are too important to sacrifice for the sake of keeping the peace. I hope sharing my story helps others feel empowered to stand up against workplace harassment. It's not easy, but it's necessary if we want to create safe and respectful environments for everyone. No one should have to dread going to work or feel unsafe doing their job. As for Mark, I haven't seen or heard from him since that day. Part of me hopes he's gotten help and changed his ways, but another part hopes I never cross paths with him again. Either way, I refuse to let the fear of what he might do control my life any longer. I'm moving forward, stronger and more resilient than ever. If you're reading this and find yourself in a similar situation, please don't suffer in silence. Document everything, reach out to trusted colleagues or HR, and know that you have the right to a safe workplace. It may be scary, but speaking up is the first step to ending the cycle of harassment and abuse. You are stronger than you know, and your voice matters. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it happened when I was only 8 years old. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon in the middle of summer break. My parents were out running errands, and I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly munching on some crackers and flipping through a comic book. Our kitchen had a clear view of the attached garage through a window next to the door. I glanced up from my comic and froze. There, in the small window of the garage door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pale, ghostly white hand was waving at me from inside the garage. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked hard and looked again, but the hand was still there. It looked almost translucent, with long, bony fingers that beckoned to me in an eerie, unnatural way. The movements were slow and deliberate, clearly trying to get my attention and lure me closer. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I sat there paralyzed with fear for what felt like an eternity. The hand continued its hypnotic waving, and I swear I could feel an evil presence emanating from the garage. Finally, I managed to tear my eyes away and bolted upstairs to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. I huddled under my blankets, shaking uncontrollably. I kept expecting to hear footsteps coming up the stairs or see that ghostly hand reach out from under my bed. But after about an hour of terrified waiting, nothing had happened. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peer out my window, which overlooked the driveway. My parents' car wasn't back yet, and everything looked normal outside. When my parents finally got home, I was still too scared to leave my room. They called up to check on me, and I mumbled some excuse about not feeling well. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me if I told them what I saw. I barely slept that night, keeping my light on and jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I cautiously made my way downstairs, half expecting to see signs of an intruder, but nothing seemed out of place. I avoided looking at the garage door as I ate breakfast. My mom noticed I was acting strange and asked if everything was okay. I considered telling her but decided against it. I figured she'd just say I was imagining things or had a bad dream. Life went back to normal over the next few weeks, and I started to convince myself that maybe I really had imagined the whole thing. I still felt uneasy around the garage, but I tried my best to push the memory out of my mind. Then, about a month later, something happened that brought it all rushing back. I was watching TV in the living room when my 6-year-old sister Amy came running in, looking pale and frightened. She was babbling incoherently, on the verge of tears. I managed to calm her down enough to explain what was wrong. What she told me made my stomach drop. She said she'd been playing with her dolls in the kitchen when she saw a ghost hand waving at her from the garage window. She described it exactly as I remembered, pale white, almost see-through, with creepy long fingers that beckoned to her. Amy said she got scared and ran away. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. There was no way this was a coincidence. Amy couldn't have known about what I saw. I'd never told anyone. And she wasn't the type to make up stories like this. I realized with dawning horror that whatever I'd seen that day was real, and it was still out there. This time, I knew we had to tell our parents. They were understandably skeptical at first, but the fear in our voices must have convinced them we weren't making it up. Dad went to investigate the garage while Mom stayed with us. I held my breath as he opened the door, half expecting some ghostly apparition to emerge. But he found nothing out of the ordinary. We searched the whole house and property, but there was no sign of an intruder or anything unusual. My parents changed the locks and installed a security system just to be safe. They told us to come to them immediately if we ever saw anything strange again. For weeks afterwards, I was jumpy and on edge. I avoided being alone in the kitchen and refused to go near the garage. Amy seemed to bounce back quicker than me, but I'd sometimes catch her staring warily at the garage door. We kept the curtains closed over the kitchen window. unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Time passed, and we never saw the ghostly hand again. But the mystery of what it was and why it appeared to us remained. As I got older, I tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was a trick of the light or an oddly shaped reflection. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. Sometimes I still get chills thinking about it, especially when I visit my parents' house. What was that thing in our garage, and what did it want with us? Was it trying to lure us in for some sinister purpose? Or was it a lost spirit, reaching out for help in the only way it could? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but the image of that pale, ethereal hand is seared into my memory forever. I've done some research over the years, looking for similar experiences or local legends that might explain it. But I've never found anything quite like what Amy and I saw. Part of me hopes it was just a bizarre one-time occurrence. But another part of me worries that whatever it was is still out there somewhere, waiting and watching. I'm in my 30s now with kids of my own. I'm probably overprotective, but I'm always hyper-aware of their whereabouts, especially around garages or dark spaces. I've warned them about strangers and taught them to trust their instincts if anything ever feels off. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but I can't shake the feeling that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that might mean us harm. I still struggle with whether or not to tell my kids about what happened. On one hand, I want them to be aware and cautious, but I also don't want to scare them unnecessarily or make them afraid of their own home. For now, I've decided to keep it to myself. But I'm always watching, always on guard, because I know firsthand that sometimes the monsters hiding in the shadows are all too real. Writing this out has brought back a lot of those old feelings of fear and uncertainty. Even after all these years, I still get goosebumps thinking about that ghostly hand waving at me. I guess some experiences just stay with you forever, no matter how much time passes. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand or come to terms with what Amy and I saw that summer. But I do know that it changed me and made me realize that there's more to this world than meets the eye. I just hope that whatever was in our garage that day never comes back, and that no one else ever has to experience anything like it. Was 17 at the time, working the late shift at Target to save up money for college. The store was about 4 miles from my house, and I always rode my bike home along this secluded bike path that cut through some woods. It usually took me about 15-20 minutes, and I'd done it so many times that I could practically ride it with my eyes closed. That night started off like any other. I clocked out around 11:30 p.m., said goodbye to my co-workers, and hopped on my bike for the familiar ride home. It was a warm June night, but there was a slight chill in the air that made me glad I'd brought a light jacket. The path was dark as usual, with just a few sparse lampposts casting pools of dim orange light every 100 feet or so. But I wasn't worried. I had my trusty headlight on my bike and knew the route like the back of my hand. About halfway through the ride, I decided to put on some music. I fished my old Walkman out of my backpack and started fiddling with it to find a good station. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a dark figure standing about 100 feet ahead of me on the path. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just a shadow or my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, I could clearly make out the silhouette of a person. They were completely motionless, just standing there in the middle of the path facing my direction. A chill ran down my spine. In all the times I'd ridden this route, I'd never encountered another person, especially not at this time of night. Every instinct was screaming at me that something wasn't right. I slowed my bike, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around, but that would mean a much longer ride home on unfamiliar roads. I decided to keep going, figuring I could just ride past quickly. But then the figure suddenly started sprinting straight towards me. Pure terror jolted through me. Without thinking, I dropped my Walkman and started pedaling as hard as I could. I heard it clatter to the ground behind me, but there was no way in hell I was stopping to get it. I've never pedaled so fast in my life. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but sheer adrenaline kept me going. I could hear rapid footsteps pounding the pavement behind me, getting closer and closer. In my panic, I nearly wiped out on a sharp turn. My back tire fishtailed, and for a heart-stopping second I thought I was going to crash. But somehow I managed to right myself and keep going. The whole time my mind was racing with horrible scenarios. Who was this person? What did they want? Were they going to kill me? Rob me? Or worse? I was certain that if they caught me, something unspeakably awful was going to happen. I don't know how long I rode like that. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, mercifully, I burst out of the woods and onto the main road near my neighborhood. As soon as I hit the streetlights, I heard the footsteps behind me suddenly stop. I chanced a quick glance over my shoulder, but there was no one there. It was like my pursuer had vanished into thin air. Even though I couldn't see or hear them anymore, I didn't slow down. I raced the final few blocks home and practically crashed into my driveway. I abandoned my bike in the front yard and ran inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. My parents were asleep, but my frantic entrance woke them up. They found me huddled on the floor by the front door, shaking and hyperventilating. It took a while for me to calm down enough to explain what had happened. Of course, they called the police right away. Officers came and took my statement, then went to search the bike path. But they didn't find anything. No signs of my pursuer, and no trace of my Walkman where I'd dropped it. The police said they'd increase patrols in the area, but ultimately there wasn't much they could do. There had been no actual assault, and I couldn't give them any real description of the person beyond tall and dark. In the days that followed, I was a nervous wreck. I jumped at every sound and shadow. I refused to be alone, especially after dark. My parents drove me to and from work, and I quit my job at Target shortly after. It's been almost a year now, and I still have nightmares about that night sometimes. I've never been back on that bike path, and I don't think I ever will. Just driving past the entrance makes my heart race. The rational part of my brain tries to come up with explanations. Maybe it was just some random creep who thought it would be funny to scare a lone girl, or a mugger who changed their mind when I started riding so fast. But there's another part of me that wonders if it was something else. The way they moved so fast, the way they seemed to disappear when I hit the main road, it almost seemed inhuman. And why were they just standing there in the middle of the path, like they were waiting for me? I'll probably never know for sure what happened that night or who or what was chasing me. But I do know that I'm never taking that shortcut through the woods again, no matter how much time it saves. Some risks just aren't worth taking. To this day, I still get an eerie feeling whenever I'm alone outside at night, like someone might be watching me from the shadows, waiting to chase me down again. I try to tell myself I'm being irrational, that lightning doesn't strike twice, but deep down, I'm not so sure. All I know is that my quiet suburban town doesn't feel quite as safe as it used to, and I'll never forget the sheer terror of that bike ride, the longest 5 minutes of my life. As I left the dentist's office on 42nd Street, I was feeling a bit groggy from the fluoride treatment and just wanted to get home. I started walking towards the nearest subway station, weaving through the typical NYC sidewalk crowds. That's when things started to get weird. I first noticed this guy about half a block ahead of me. He was a big dude, probably 6'2" or 6'3", wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up despite it being a warm day. Something about the way he was moving caught my attention. He seemed to be zigzagging across the sidewalk, bumping into people as he went. I didn't think much of it at first. This is New York, after all. You see all kinds of strange behavior on the streets. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't just randomly bumping into people. He was specifically targeting women, shouldering into them hard enough to knock some of them off balance. My guard went up immediately. I slowed my pace, trying to put some distance between us. But the sidewalk was packed with the usual midday crowd, and I couldn't really maneuver around without shoving past people myself. As I got within about 10 feet of this guy, he suddenly whirled around and locked eyes with me. I felt a chill go through me. His eyes had this wild, unfocused look. Before I could react, he lunged towards me and slammed his shoulder into my chest, sending me stumbling backwards. "Hey, what the hell?" I yelled, catching myself on a nearby newsstand. My heart was racing. The guy just sneered at me and kept walking. I stood there for a second, trying to catch my breath. A few people glanced at me, but no one stopped. Classic New York. I thought about calling out to a cop or something, but I didn't see any around. I figured the best thing to do was just get to the subway as quickly as possible. I started speed walking, keeping an eye out for the guy in the hoodie. That's when I noticed he had doubled back and was heading towards me again. My stomach dropped. This clearly wasn't random. He was targeting me specifically now. I picked up my pace, practically jogging at this point. But the sidewalk was so crowded, I couldn't move fast enough. I could see him getting closer out of the corner of my eye. Just as I was about to break into a full sprint, he slammed into me again, even harder this time. I went flying, my purse spilling open as I hit the ground. I scraped my palms trying to break my fall. For a second, I just lay there, dazed. Then I heard heavy footsteps approaching, and panic jolted through me. I scrambled to gather my things, my hands shaking. That's when I heard a deep voice boom out, "Hey, back off, buddy." I looked up to see another man step between me and the guy in the hoodie. This new guy was tall too, but bulkier. He looked like he could handle himself in a fight. He was wearing jeans and a plain black t-shirt, nothing that screamed cop or anything. The hoodie guy hesitated for a second, then tried to lunge past my protector to get to me again. But the guy in the black shirt was faster. He shoved Hoodie Man hard, sending him staggering back into the crowd. "I said back off," he yelled again. "Don't make me say it a third time." Something in his tone must have gotten through, because Hoodie Guy suddenly turned and took off running down the street. I was still on the ground, my heart pounding. The guy in the black shirt turned to me and crouched down. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now. I nodded, still a bit stunned. "I think so. Thank you so much." He helped me to my feet and started gathering the rest of my scattered belongings. "No problem. That guy's been causing trouble up and down the block. Cops are looking for him but haven't caught up yet." As he handed me my things, I got a better look at him. He was probably in his late 30s or early 40s, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and sharp blue eyes. There was something vaguely military about his bearing. "Are you a cop?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nah, just a concerned citizen. You said you were heading to the subway, right? Which station? I hesitated for a second, not sure if I should tell this stranger where I was going. But he had just saved me from God knows what, so I figured I could trust him. Yeah, I'm going to the 42nd Street station, I said. He nodded. All right, I'll walk you there. That creep might still be lurking around. I started to protest that he didn't need to go out of his way, but he cut me off. I insist. It's not safe right now. As we started walking, I noticed he was scanning the crowd constantly, clearly on high alert. I tried to make some small talk to calm my nerves. So, do you live around here? I asked. He just grunted non-committally. I'm familiar with the area. I tried a few more questions but got similarly vague responses. It was clear he wasn't interested in chatting. We had only gone about half a block when I spotted the hoodie guy again. He was across the street this time, pacing back and forth and glaring in our direction. My breath caught in my throat. My protector saw him too. Without warning, he suddenly scooped me up in his arms like I weighed nothing. Hold on, he said gruffly. We're gonna move fast. Before I could even process what was happening, he took off running down the sidewalk, easily weaving through the startled pedestrians. I clung to his neck, too shocked to protest. We covered the last 2 blocks to the subway entrance in what felt like seconds. He set me down gently at the top of the stairs. Go straight to the platform and get on the first train that comes. Doesn't matter which direction, he said urgently. Don't stop. Don't look back. You'll be safe once you're in the station. I nodded, still a bit dazed. Thank you again. I don't know how to repay you. He shook his head. No need. Just be careful out there. I turned to head down the stairs, then glanced back to ask for his name. But he was already gone, vanished into the crowd like he'd never been there at all. I followed his instructions, hurrying through the turnstiles and onto the first train that pulled up. It wasn't until I was safely on my way home that the reality of what had just happened really hit me. I still don't know who that man was or why he helped me. Was he an off-duty cop? Some kind of vigilante? Just a good Samaritan in the right place at the right time? I'll probably never know for sure. But I do know that if he hadn't been there, things could have gone very differently for me that day. It's easy to get jaded living in a big city like New York, to start seeing everyone as a potential threat. But sometimes a stranger really can be a guardian angel. I've replayed the incident in my head 100 times since then. Every time I walk down that stretch of 42nd Street, I find myself scanning the crowds, half expecting to see my mysterious protector again. But he's never reappeared. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I look down at the scrapes on my palms, still healing, and I know it was real. I don't think I'll ever forget the fear I felt when that man kept slamming into me, or the relief when my protector showed up. It's a cliché to say that the experience changed me, but it really did alter how I move through the city. I'm more aware of my surroundings now, more cautious. But I'm also more willing to step in if I see someone else in trouble. My protector showed me that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to get involved to make a huge difference. I still have so many questions. Who was that man in the hoodie, and what was he really after? Why did he target me specifically? And who was the man who saved me? Where did he come from, and where did he disappear to? Part of me wants answers, but another part is oddly okay with the mystery. In a way, not knowing makes the whole thing feel almost magical, like a guardian angel really did swoop in to save me that day. I know one thing for certain, though. I'll never again underestimate the potential impact of a stranger's kindness. In a city of millions, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to step up and do the right thing. I only hope that someday I'll have the opportunity to pay it forward and be that person for someone else in need. Work as a bartender at this little dive bar downtown. It's not the fanciest place, but the regulars are cool and the tips are decent. That night, I had closed up around 2 a.m. as usual. I was exhausted after a long shift, but at least the weather was nice for my ride home. I have this electric scooter I use to commute. It's convenient and way cheaper than Uber, especially for late-night trips. I hopped on and started cruising down the quiet streets, enjoying the cool night air. The city looks so different at that hour, kinda eerie but peaceful too. About halfway home, my phone buzzed. Probably just a random notification, but I decided to pull over and check real quick. There's this little park area with some benches and landscaping where I usually stop if I need to. I parked the scooter and pulled out my phone. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was just leaves rustling or something. But then I saw him, this incredibly tall, lanky figure slowly rising up from behind some bushes. It was so unnatural, the way he unfolded himself, like inhumanly tall. My heart started racing immediately. Why the hell was someone hiding in the bushes at 2:30 a.m.? I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe it was just some drunk guy who had passed out there. But something about the way he moved set off all kinds of alarm bells. He started walking towards me, stumbling a bit. I could hear him muttering something but couldn't make out the words. It was this low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I quickly shoved my phone in my pocket and grabbed the scooter, ready to take off. But then I froze. What if this guy needed help? What if he was hurt or lost? I hesitated for a second, which was stupid in hindsight. That moment of uncertainty was all he needed to get way too close. As he got nearer, I could see his face in the dim streetlight. His eyes were wide and unfocused, darting around frantically. He was so pale and gaunt, almost skeletal, and he reeked, this sour, unwashed smell that made me gag. I started backing away, dragging the scooter with me. "Hey man, you okay?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond, just kept stumbling forward and muttering. That's when I noticed a couple walking on the other side of the street. Thank God, other people. I waved and shouted to them, "Hey, can you help? I think this guy needs assistance." The couple stopped and looked over, clearly unsure what to do. But before they could respond, the creepy guy's whole demeanor suddenly changed. He straightened up and called out in this fake cheerful voice, "Oh, there you are, sis. I've been looking everywhere for you." He tried to smile at me, but it was this twisted grimace that sent chills down my spine. Then he turned to the couple and said, "So sorry to bother you folks. My sister here forgot to take her medication. I'm just trying to get her home safe." I was stunned. What the actual fuck? This psycho was trying to make it look like I was the unstable one. I shouted to the couple, "He's lying. I don't know this man." The guy took another step towards me, still grinning that horrible smile. "Come on, sis, let's get you home," he said, reaching for my arm. Everything happened so fast after that. As his hand shot out to grab me, I instinctively reached into my bag. I always carry pepper spray, occupational hazard of being a woman working late nights. I whipped it out and sprayed directly in his face just as he lunged at me. He let out this inhuman shriek and stumbled backwards, clawing at his eyes. I scrambled onto my scooter, hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the handlebars. I saw the couple running over, shouting something, but I didn't wait around. I took off as fast as that scooter could go, not looking back once. I rode straight home in a blind panic, taking random turns to make sure I wasn't followed. When I finally got to my apartment, I ran inside and locked every deadbolt. I was hyperventilating, barely able to breathe. It took hours for the adrenaline to wear off enough for me to stop shaking. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bring myself to leave my apartment. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I had overreacted. But then I'd remember those wild eyes, that twisted smile, and I'd feel sick all over again. I ended up filing a police report, but they didn't seem too concerned. Said it was probably just some drugged-out homeless guy, nothing to worry about. But I can't shake the feeling that it was something more sinister. The way he tried to manipulate the situation, how quickly he switched tactics. It seemed way too calculated for a random encounter. It's been months now, and I still get nervous riding my scooter at night. I've changed up my route home, and I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings. I can't help but wonder, what if I hadn't had that pepper spray? What if that couple hadn't been there? The thought makes my blood run cold. I don't know if I'll ever feel totally safe again. That night changed something in me. I realized how quickly things can go wrong, how vulnerable we all are. I'm sharing this as a warning. Trust your instincts, stay aware, and always have a way to protect yourself. You never know when you might need it. I was 17 at the time, living in Utrecht, Netherlands, with my best friends Emma and Lena. We were typical teenagers, obsessed with our phones, always looking for the next adventure. One night, we decided to try our luck on Tinder. We knew we were underage, but we figured we could pass for 18 easily enough. After swiping for a while, we matched with this cute guy named Thomas, who said he was 18. We chatted for a bit and he suggested meeting up at a local bar called the Blue Anchor. We were thrilled, our first Tinder date. We spent hours getting ready, doing our makeup and picking out our cutest outfits. Looking back, we were so naive. When we got to the bar, we realized we had a problem. None of us had fake IDs, but the bouncer barely glanced at us as we walked in, clearly not caring about checking. The place was dimly lit and packed with people. We looked around for Thomas but didn't see anyone matching his profile pic. After about 15 minutes of awkwardly standing near the bar, this older guy approached us. He looked to be in his early 30s, tall with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He introduced himself as Mark and asked if we wanted to join him for a drink. We hesitated at first, but he was charming and insisted on buying us whatever we wanted. Against our better judgment, we accepted. Mark led us to a corner booth and ordered a round of beers. We sipped them slowly, still scanning the room for Thomas. Mark asked us all kinds of questions, where we went to school, our hobbies, our families. Looking back, he was clearly fishing for information. As the night went on, Mark kept the drinks coming. I started to feel a bit dizzy and noticed Emma was slurring her words. Only Lena seemed relatively sober. Mark's demeanor had shifted too. He was sitting closer to us, putting his arm around Emma's shoulders, touching Lena's leg. It made me deeply uncomfortable, but I felt too hazy to say anything. That's when I noticed the bartender, a woman in her 40s, watching us intently. She caught my eye and gestured for me to come over. I excused myself to use the restroom and made my way to the bar. "Listen, honey, you need to get your friends and leave right now," she said in a low, urgent voice. "That man is bad news. He comes in here all the time, always targeting young girls like you. Last month a girl went missing after leaving with him." A chill ran down my spine. I mumbled a thank you and rushed back to our table. I whispered to Lena what the bartender had told me. Her eyes went wide with fear. "We need to go," I said loudly. "Our parents just called and we have to get home." Mark's expression darkened. "But the night's still young. Stay for one more drink." "No, we really can't," Lena said firmly, helping Emma to her feet. Mark stood up, blocking our path. "I insist," he said, his voice low and menacing. My heart was pounding. I thought we were trapped. But then the bartender appeared beside us. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, staring Mark down. He hesitated, then stepped aside. "No problem at all. The ladies were just leaving." We practically ran out of the bar, not stopping until we were several blocks away. Emma was sobbing, the reality of what almost happened sinking in. We called a taxi and went straight home, too shaken to speak. The next day, we debated whether to go to the police. But we were scared of getting in trouble for using fake Tinder accounts and being underage in a bar. So we kept quiet, deleting our profiles and swearing never to do anything so reckless again. It's been months, but I still have nightmares about Mark's cold blue eyes and what might have happened if that bartender hadn't intervened. I shudder to think how many other girls weren't so lucky. I know we made a huge mistake that night. We put ourselves in real danger by lying about our age and meeting a stranger. But I also can't shake the feeling that we were deliberately targeted. The whole thing, the fake Tinder profile, Mark being there waiting, it felt like a carefully laid trap. Sometimes I wonder if Thomas even existed, or if it was Mark all along, luring naive girls to that bar. The thought makes me sick. I still haven't told my parents what happened. How do you even begin to explain something like that? But I needed to share this story as a warning to others. Trust your instincts. Be careful who you talk to online. And never, ever meet up with a stranger alone. I consider myself incredibly lucky that we got out of there safely. But the experience shattered my sense of security and trust. I'm much more cautious now, always looking over my shoulder. Part of me wants to track Mark down and make sure he can't hurt anyone else. But mostly, I just want to forget that terrifying night ever happened. If you're reading this and considering meeting someone from the internet, please be so careful. Things aren't always what they seem. What looks like an exciting adventure can turn into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll carry it with me forever. Was just another ordinary day in our camp. The sun was beating down mercilessly, as it always did in those parts. My great-great-grandfather, let's call him Nakohe, was just a young boy at the time, maybe 12 or 13 years old. He was out collecting firewood with some of the other kids when they heard the first screams. At first, they thought it was just the women calling them back for lunch. But then the screams got louder, more frantic. Nakohe dropped his bundle of sticks and ran towards the camp, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he could see smoke rising above the teepees. And then he saw them, the scalp hunters. There must have been at least 20 of them, maybe more. They came out of nowhere, on horseback, whooping and hollering like demons straight out of hell. Nakohe froze in terror as he watched them charge into the camp, guns blazing and knives flashing in the sunlight. The Tonkawa warriors tried to fight back, but they were caught completely off guard. It was a massacre. Nakohe saw his father fall, an arrow protruding from his chest. His mother was dragged from their teepee, screaming. He wanted to run to her, to help her, but his legs wouldn't move. One of the older boys grabbed Nakohe and pulled him into the bushes. "Hide," he hissed. "Don't make a sound." And then he was gone, running back towards the camp with a knife in his hand. Nakohe never saw him again. For what felt like hours, Nakohe huddled in those bushes, shaking uncontrollably. He could hear the screams, the gunshots, the sickening sound of metal slicing through flesh. The smell of blood and smoke filled his nostrils. He wanted to vomit, but he was too scared to make a sound. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the noises stopped. The scalp hunters had finished their grisly work. Nakohe could hear them laughing, congratulating each other as they rode away. He waited until he couldn't hear their horses anymore before he dared to move. When he finally emerged from his hiding place, the sight that greeted him was worse than anything he could have imagined. Bodies were strewn everywhere, mutilated beyond recognition. The ground was soaked with blood. Teepees were still smoldering, sending plumes of acrid smoke into the air. Nakohe wandered through the carnage in a daze, desperately searching for any sign of life. But there was none. Everyone he had ever known and loved was gone. His entire world had been wiped out in the span of a few hours. As the reality of his situation began to sink in, Nakohe knew he couldn't stay there. The scalp hunters might come back, or worse, the scavengers would soon arrive to feast on the dead. With a heavy heart, he gathered what supplies he could find, a knife, a water skin, some dried meat, and set off. He had heard the elders speak of a place called El Paso, where there were white men who might help him. It was far to the west, across harsh and unforgiving terrain. But it was his only hope. The journey was brutal. Nakohe walked for days, his feet blistered and bleeding. The sun scorched his skin by day, and the cold desert nights left him shivering uncontrollably. He rationed his meager supplies as best he could, but soon they ran out. Hunger gnawed at his belly, a constant, painful reminder of his desperate situation. He tried to hunt, but he was weak and inexperienced. The few animals he saw were too quick for him to catch. On the fifth day, when Nakohe thought he couldn't go on any longer, he stumbled upon the carcass of a buffalo. It had been dead for some time, and the meat was rotten and crawling with maggots. But Nakohe was so hungry that he didn't care. He cut open the animal's stomach and, fighting back waves of nausea, ate the partially digested grass he found inside. It was the most disgusting thing he had ever tasted, but it kept him alive. He carried some of it with him, forcing himself to eat it when the hunger became unbearable. The thought of it still makes me want to gag. Somehow, against all odds, Nakohe made it to El Paso. He was more dead than alive when he staggered into town, sunburned, emaciated, and barely able to stand. A kind-hearted woman took him in, nursed him back to health, and eventually adopted him as her own. But Nakohe never forgot what happened to his people. The memories haunted him for the rest of his life. He would wake up screaming in the night, reliving the horrors of that day. Even as an old man, his hands would shake when he spoke of it. He made sure to pass the story down to his children, and they to theirs, so that the sacrifice of the Tonkawa would never be forgotten. And now, I'm sharing it with you. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can almost see it happening. I can hear the screams, smell the smoke and blood. It's like I was there, you know? I've had nightmares about it, even though it happened long before I was born. I've done some research over the years, trying to find out more about what happened. It turns out that scalp hunting was a real thing back then. The Mexican government actually paid bounties for Native American scalps. It's sickening to think about. I visited the site where it happened. There's nothing there now, just empty desert. But standing there, knowing what took place on that very ground, it sent chills down my spine. I swear I could feel the presence of those who died there, like their spirits are still lingering, unable to find peace. I often wonder how Nakohe found the strength to go on after witnessing such horror. How did he live with those memories? How did he not give up during that hellish journey across the desert? I'd like to think I would be that strong, but I honestly don't know. This story has been a part of my family for generations, shaping who we are and how we see the world. It's a reminder of the cruelty humans are capable of, but also of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. I'm sharing this now because I think it's important for people to know what happened. The Tonkawa, like many Native American tribes, suffered unimaginable atrocities. Their stories deserve to be told, their memories honored. So if you've read this far, thank you. Thank you for bearing witness to my family's history, to Nakohe's incredible story of survival. And next time you hear someone talk about the glory days of the Old West, remember this story. Remember the Tonkawa. Remember Nakohe. Because history isn't always what we think it is, and the truth is often more horrifying than we can imagine. I never thought a simple day hike could turn into such a terrifying ordeal. It was supposed to be a relaxing solo trip up Mount Hood, something I'd done dozens of times before without incident. But this time was different. This time I came face to face with true evil on that mountain, and I'm still shaken by it weeks later. It was a beautiful, clear day in early fall. The air was crisp, and the trails weren't too crowded yet. I set out early, around 7 a.m., planning to do a challenging 12-mile loop. I was in a great mood, listening to music and taking in the gorgeous scenery as I made my way up the mountain. About 2 hours in, I stopped at a scenic overlook to snap some photos and have a snack. That's when I first noticed him. A man probably in his 40s, wearing jeans and a light jacket. Definitely not dressed for a strenuous hike. He was standing off to the side, staring intently in my direction. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach and focus on enjoying the view. As I packed up to continue on, the man approached me. "Excuse me, miss, but I believe you have my backpack," he said in an oddly calm voice. I was confused. The pack I was wearing was clearly mine. It was bright purple and covered in patches from my various travels. "I'm sorry, but this is definitely my pack," I replied, trying to stay polite. "I've had it for years." He shook his head and took a step closer. "No, you're mistaken. That's my pack, and I need you to give it back now." There was an unsettling intensity in his eyes that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, my heart starting to race. "Sir, I can assure you this is my pack. Please leave me alone." I turned to continue up the trail, hoping that would be the end of it, but I could hear his footsteps behind me. "You know, it's not nice to steal," he called out, his voice taking on an angry edge. "What would your parents think if they knew you were a thief?" I picked up my pace, fear rising in my chest. Who was this guy, and why was he so fixated on my backpack? I glanced back and saw he was matching my speed, staying about 20 feet behind me. "I'm not stealing anything," I said firmly. "This is my pack, and I'd appreciate if you'd stop following me." He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed off the rocky cliffs. "Oh, sweetheart, we both know that's a lie. Why don't you just admit what you did and give me back my property? Then we can forget this whole thing ever happened." I was really starting to panic now. We were in a pretty isolated section of trail, and I hadn't seen any other hikers for at least 30 minutes. I picked up the pace even more, practically jogging up the steep incline. "Leave me alone," I yelled over my shoulder. I'm going to report you if you don't back off right now." "Report me? For what? Trying to get back what's rightfully mine?" His voice was dripping with mock innocence. "You're the one who should be worried about getting in trouble here, little girl." The condescending way he said, "little girl," made my blood run cold. This guy was seriously unhinged. I fumbled for my phone, cursing under my breath when I saw I had no service. Of course, I rounded a bend in the trail and nearly cried with relief when I saw two other hikers up ahead, an older couple taking a water break. I rushed towards them, hearing the man's footsteps quicken behind me. "Please, I need help," I gasped as I reached the couple. "This man has been following me and harassing me. He keeps insisting my backpack is his." The woman looked alarmed, and her husband stepped protectively in front of her. But before they could respond, the man caught up, breathing heavily. "Oh, thank goodness. I've been chasing after my sister for miles," he said, his demeanor completely changed. He was the picture of concerned brother now. "I'm so sorry to bother you folks, but Lucy here has some mental health issues, and she ran off with my backpack. We've been so worried." I stared at him in disbelief. Was this really happening? "He's lying," I said desperately. "I've never seen this man before in my life. He just started following me and saying my pack was his. Please, you have to believe me." The couple looked back and forth between us, clearly unsure what to think. The man moved closer, reaching for my arm. "Come on, sis. Let's not bother these nice people any longer. Mom and Dad are waiting for us back at the car." I yanked my arm away and stumbled backwards. "Don't touch me. Someone please call the Rangers or the police or something. This man is dangerous." "Now, Lucy, there's no need to make a scene," he said in a patronizing tone. "Just give me the backpack and we can go home. You know how you get when you don't take your medication." Tears of frustration and fear were streaming down my face now. How could this be happening? How could anyone believe this lunatic? But then the woman spoke up. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to back away from her. We saw her hiking alone earlier, and she certainly didn't seem distressed then. I think it's best if you leave." The man's face darkened. "You don't understand. She needs help. She's sick and confused." "I said back off," the woman's husband said firmly. "We're going to escort this young lady back down the mountain and call the authorities. I suggest you go in the opposite direction." For a moment, I thought the man was going to lash out. But then a group of rowdy college-aged hikers came around the bend. He seemed to realize he was outnumbered. "Fine," he spat. "Have it your way. But this isn't over, Lucy. I'll be seeing you again real soon." With that, he turned and strode quickly up the trail. I broke down sobbing, the terror and adrenaline finally overwhelming me. The kind couple comforted me and helped me back down the mountain, where we were met by park rangers. I filed a report, but they never found the man. They said there had been a few similar incidents reported in the area recently. It's been weeks, but I still have nightmares about those cold, calculating eyes. I can't shake the feeling that he's out there, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe on a trail again. What started as a peaceful hike turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. I'm sharing this as a warning. Always trust your instincts and be aware of your surroundings, even in places that seem safe. You never know what kind of evil might be lurking just around the bend. I never thought I'd be in a situation like this. It all started about 6 months ago when Jake joined our team at the marketing firm where I work. At first, I felt bad for him. He had hearing loss and sometimes struggled to follow conversations. We all tried our best to accommodate him, speaking clearly and repeating things when needed. But within a few weeks, I started to notice some unsettling behavior from Jake. It began with inappropriate comments. He'd make crude sexual jokes or remark on women's appearances in the office. I brushed it off at first, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. Maybe he just had poor social skills, I thought. As time went on, though, his behavior got worse. He'd deliberately ignore instructions from our female team lead, Sarah, acting like he couldn't hear or understand her. But when the male manager spoke, he'd perk right up and follow directions perfectly. It became clear he was using his hearing impairment selectively. Things escalated further when Jake started physically intimidating the women in the office. He'd stand too close, blocking doorways or cornering people at their desks. I'd often find him hovering behind me while I was working, breathing down my neck. When I'd turn around startled, he'd just smile and shrug as if he didn't realize what he was doing. One day, I was working late and needed to use the restroom. As I walked down the hallway, Jake suddenly appeared and blocked my path. He stood there silently, not moving, forcing me to squeeze past him. As I did, I felt his hand brush against my backside. I froze, unsure if it was intentional or accidental. When I looked back, he was smirking at me. My skin crawled. After that incident, I started warning the other women to be careful around Jake. We'd try to avoid being alone with him, always keeping our guard up. But it was exhausting constantly being on edge at work. I dreaded coming to the office each day, never knowing what Jake might do or say. The final straw came last week. I was in a meeting with Jake and another co-worker, Lisa. Jake kept interrupting Lisa, talking over her and dismissing her ideas. At one point, he reached across the table and put his hand on her thigh, squeezing it as he leaned in close to her face. Lisa looked terrified, too shocked to react. I'd had enough. As soon as the meeting ended, I marched straight to HR and reported everything. The comments, the intimidation, the touching. I felt sick to my stomach as I recounted all the incidents, but I knew I had to speak up. HR took my complaint seriously and launched an investigation. They interviewed other employees and reviewed security footage. Within days, Jake was called into a meeting with HR and upper management. I later found out he'd been terminated effective immediately. As Jake was being escorted out of the building, he started shouting about discrimination and threatening lawsuits. He locked eyes with me across the office, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he yelled. "You'll regret this." Security had to physically remove him as he continued ranting. In the days since, the office has felt much calmer. There's a sense of relief among the women especially, but I still feel on edge, worried that Jake might try to retaliate somehow. I keep replaying his threats in my mind. I'm glad I spoke up, but part of me wishes I'd done it sooner. How many other women did Jake harass before I finally said something? Could I have prevented some of it if I'd reported the early red flags? This whole ordeal has been eye-opening. I never imagined I'd experience workplace harassment like this, especially not from someone with a disability. It just goes to show that anyone can be a predator, and we can't let our sympathy or desire to be accommodating override our instincts when something feels wrong. I'm sharing this story as a reminder to trust your gut and speak up if you see inappropriate behavior at work. Document everything, report it through proper channels, and don't let fear keep you silent. No one should have to feel unsafe or uncomfortable in their workplace. The experience has definitely changed me. I'm more vigilant now, more aware of the subtle ways harassment can manifest. But I'm also more confident in my ability to stand up for myself and others. If anything good came out of this nightmare, it's that I found my voice and the courage to use it. Still, I can't help but wonder if Jake is out there somewhere, potentially harassing other women at a new job. The thought makes me sick. I hope that by sharing my story, I can encourage others to be aware and take action if they encounter similar situations. It's been a week since Jake was fired, and things are slowly getting back to normal at work. But I still flinch sometimes when I hear footsteps behind me in the hallway. I still hesitate before rounding corners, half expecting to see Jake lurking there. I know it's irrational, but the fear lingers. I've started seeing a therapist to work through the anxiety and stress from this ordeal. She's helping me process everything and develop coping strategies. It's been really helpful to have a safe space to talk about my feelings and fears. My coworkers have been incredibly supportive. Many of them have thanked me for speaking up, sharing their own experiences of discomfort around Jake that they'd been too afraid to report. It's heartening to know I made a difference, but also sad to realize how many of us were suffering in silence. The company has implemented new harassment training and reporting procedures in the wake of this incident. They've made it clear that they have a zero-tolerance policy for any kind of harassment or discrimination. It's a positive step, but I can't help but think it shouldn't have taken something this extreme to prompt action. As I reflect on everything that happened, I'm struck by how insidious workplace harassment can be. It often starts small, a comment here, a look there, and escalates gradually. By the time you realize how bad it's gotten, you're already deep in it, questioning yourself and your perceptions. I hope my story serves as a wake-up call for others. Don't ignore those early warning signs. Don't make excuses for bad behavior, even if the person has a disability or seems otherwise disadvantaged. Trust your instincts and speak up. To anyone out there dealing with harassment at work, you're not alone, and it's not your fault. Document everything, report it, and don't be afraid to keep escalating if nothing is done. Your safety and well-being matter. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time. Some days are harder than others, but I'm proud of myself for standing up to Jake and putting an end to his behavior. I know I did the right thing, even if it wasn't easy. And if I ever encounter a situation like this again, I won't hesitate to act. We all deserve to feel safe and respected at work. But as we settled in for the night, I had an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. The forest seemed too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off as just being unused to the deep silence after city living. We went to bed early, tired from the day's activities. I jolted awake sometime in the middle of the night. At first I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside. I lay frozen, straining my ears. There it was again, definite scratching, like claws or nails dragging across the wooden exterior of the cabin. "Tom," I whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Tom, wake up. Do you hear that?" He stirred groggily. "Hear what?" Then his eyes widened as the scratching intensified. "It's probably just a raccoon or something," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The scratching continued, moving along the wall. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. The movements were too deliberate, too rhythmic. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Tom got up and grabbed a flashlight. "I'm going to check it out," he said. "Don't," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "What if it's a bear or a person?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "We need to know what it is. I'll be careful, I promise." I watched nervously as he crept to the window and peered out. The scratching had stopped. Tom slowly panned the flashlight beam across the yard, but there was nothing there. Just as he was about to turn away, the scratching started up again, this time right beneath the window. Tom jumped back with a yelp. We stared at each other wide-eyed, barely breathing. The scratching continued, slow and methodical. It didn't sound random like an animal. It was as if whatever was out there was carving something into the wood. "We need to call for help," I whispered. Tom nodded and grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. Of course, we were miles from the nearest town. We were on our own. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, moving from one part of the cabin to another. We huddled together on the bed, jumping at every creak and groan of the old wooden structure. I kept imagining horrible things: a deranged hermit, a vengeful spirit, some kind of forest demon. My mind was running wild with terrifying possibilities. Finally, as the faintest light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the scratching stopped. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, but the forest remained silent. "I'm going to check outside," Tom said after a while. I wanted to stop him, but I knew we couldn't just stay trapped inside forever. So I nodded, my throat too tight with fear to speak. Tom cautiously opened the door, peering out. When nothing jumped out at us, he stepped onto the porch. I followed close behind, clutching a heavy flashlight as a makeshift weapon. We slowly circled the cabin, examining every inch of the exterior walls. At first we saw nothing, and I started to wonder if we had imagined the whole thing. But then we turned the corner to the back of the cabin and stopped dead in our tracks. There, carved into the wooden siding, were strange symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen. They looked ancient, primal, curves and jagged lines forming intricate patterns. Some of the carvings were so deep they had splintered the wood. "What the hell?" Tom breathed. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the bizarre markings. "Tom, these look like demonic symbols," I whispered. He shook his head. "That's crazy. It must have been some kind of animal." But we both knew no animal could have made such precise, deliberate carvings, and some of the symbols were chest-high, far too tall for any local wildlife. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." Tom didn't argue. We rushed back inside and threw our belongings haphazardly into our bags. I kept glancing nervously out the windows, half expecting to see some horrific creature staring back at me. But the forest remained still and silent. We were in the car and speeding down the dirt road within minutes. I didn't start breathing normally until we hit the main highway. We drove straight home without stopping, both too shaken to even discuss what had happened. It's been weeks now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, the sound of that scratching echoing in my mind. We reported the incident to the local sheriff, but they didn't find anything. The rental company said no one else has reported any issues with the cabin. I've spent countless hours researching those symbols online, but I've never found an exact match. The closest I've come are some ancient pagan and occult markings, but nothing that explains what we experienced. Part of me wants to go back, to investigate further and try to make sense of it all, but a bigger part of me never wants to set foot in those woods again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I don't know if it was something supernatural or just some sick person's idea of a prank. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, or the bone-chilling sound of whatever was out there, carving its cryptic message into our cabin. I used to love the peaceful quiet of nature. Now, that silence fills me with dread, wondering what might be lurking just out of sight, waiting to make itself known. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. The crisp mountain air, the crunch of pine needles under my boots, the peaceful solitude of the forest. It all started out so perfect. But things can change in an instant out there in the wilderness. I'm an avid hiker from Boise, and I'd been looking forward to exploring a new trail in Beaverhead National Forest for weeks. It was early October, my favorite time to hit the trails. The aspens were turning golden. There was a hint of winter in the air, but the weather was still mild enough for some serious trekking. I set out at dawn, excited to spend the day wandering through the rugged beauty of the Maverick and Stewart Mountains. The trail started out well marked, winding through dense pine forest. But as I got deeper into the backcountry, the path became less distinct. I wasn't too worried, though. I'm experienced in wilderness navigation, and I had my GPS and paper maps as backup. Around midday, I decided to venture off the main trail to check out a promising ridge I'd spotted. The views from up there would be incredible, I thought. As I picked my way through the underbrush, I caught a whiff of wood smoke on the breeze. Odd, I thought. I wasn't aware of any designated campsites in this area. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. Following my nose, I pushed through a thicket of scraggly pines and found myself in a small clearing. And there, nestled against the hillside, was a ramshackle cabin I never expected to see. It was a crude structure, clearly built by hand from rough-hewn logs and salvaged materials. A crooked stone chimney puffed wisps of smoke. Scattered around the yard were piles of scrap metal, old car parts, and other junk. The whole scene had a distinctly unwelcoming vibe. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, debating whether to quietly back away or announce my presence. Before I could decide, the cabin door burst open with a bang. A wild-looking man with a tangled beard and filthy clothes came storming out, brandishing a rifle. "What the hell you doing here?" he bellowed, leveling the gun at my chest. "This is private property." I raised my hand slowly, my heart pounding. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to trespass," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just a hiker. I got a little lost. I'll leave right away." The man's eyes were feverish, darting around as if expecting more intruders to materialize from the woods. "Ain't no hikers allowed up here," he snarled. "This here's my land. Government can't take it from me." I nodded, taking a careful step backward. "Of course I understand. I'll just be on my way then." "Not so fast," he gestured with the rifle. "How do I know you ain't some government spy, huh? Come to report on me?" No, nothing like that," I assured him. "I swear, I'm just a regular guy out for a hike. I had no idea anyone lived up here." He squinted at me suspiciously. "Swear, huh? All right then, let's hear you swear. Get down on your knees." Seeing no choice, I slowly knelt on the pine needles, hands still raised. The man loomed over me, rifle aimed at my head. "Now repeat after me," he commanded. "I swear on my life and the lives of my family." With a trembling voice, I repeated his words. "That I will never breathe a word about this place or the man I met here." I dutifully echoed him, my mouth dry with fear. "And if I break this sacred oath, may God strike me dead and damn my soul to hell for all eternity." I finished the bizarre pledge, my hands shaking. What kind of madman was I dealing with? But he wasn't done. For the next 20 minutes, he forced me to swear increasingly elaborate and nonsensical oaths. I had to promise everything from cutting off my own fingers if I told anyone, to sacrificing my firstborn child to woodland spirits. By the end, I was mentally and emotionally exhausted. Finally satisfied, the man lowered his rifle slightly. "All right, get out of here. And remember, I got eyes and ears all over these mountains. I'll know if you talk." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet and beat a hasty retreat into the forest, not daring to look back until I was well away from that nightmarish clearing. I hiked for hours, my mind reeling, before I felt safe enough to stop and catch my breath. That night, huddled in my tent, every snapping twig and rustle of leaves had me on edge. I kept imagining that unhinged mountain man lurking in the darkness, waiting to exact revenge for some imagined betrayal. I barely slept a wink. As soon as I got back to civilization, I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office. They took my statement, but didn't seem overly concerned. "Probably just some old hermit," the deputy shrugged. "As long as he's not hurting anyone, we tend to leave those types alone." I pressed them to at least check it out, worried about hikers who might stumble into the same situation. They assured me they'd send someone to investigate, but I got the feeling it wasn't a high priority. A few weeks later, I called to follow up. They claimed they'd searched the area I described, but found no sign of any cabin or resident. The whole thing was starting to feel like some surreal dream. But I know what I saw. I can still picture that deranged man's face, still hear his ranting voice in my nightmares. Sometimes I wonder if he's still up there, defending his imaginary kingdom against perceived intruders. Or did he somehow get wind of my report and vanish deeper into the wilderness? I've mostly put it behind me now, but that encounter changed how I approach my beloved mountain hikes. I'm more cautious, always on alert for signs of hidden human activity, and I never, ever stray from marked trails anymore. If there's a lesson here, I suppose it's that even in this interconnected modern world, there are still people living on the fringes of society, people who've rejected civilization and carved out their own isolated existence. Most are probably harmless, but some, well, you never know what you might stumble into out there in the wild. So to all my fellow hikers and outdoor enthusiasts, stay safe out there. Stick to the trails, trust your instincts, and remember that not all the dangers in the wilderness come from nature. Sometimes the scariest things you'll encounter have two legs and a gun. I still love the mountains, still find peace and beauty in nature. But that day in Beaverhead Forest taught me that true wilderness is more wild, more unpredictable, and potentially more dangerous than I ever imagined. It's a humbling reminder of just how small and vulnerable we humans can be in the face of both natural and human threats lurking in those remote places. I've never been back to that particular area. Part of me is curious to see if any trace of that bizarre encounter remains. But a bigger part of me is content to let that mystery stay buried in the mountains. Some experiences are best left in the past, filed away as a strange footnote in life's journey. Still, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the pines, I can't help but wonder, is he still out there, guarding his lonely domain against imagined enemies? Or has he faded into forest legend, another ghostly tale to be shared around campfires? I suppose I'll never know for sure. And maybe that uncertainty, that lingering shadow of the unknown, is the most unsettling part of all. I'm an avid hiker, and I've been exploring the trails at Stevens Creek for years. It's a beautiful area with dense forests and winding creeks, the perfect escape from the bustle of everyday life. I usually go a few times a month to clear my head and get some exercise. On this particular day in late October, I decided to check out some of the less traveled paths deeper in the woods. The fall colors were at their peak, and I wanted to soak in the scenery before winter set in. As I made my way along the trail, I noticed something odd tucked away in a small clearing, what looked like a makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves. Curious, I went over to investigate. It was definitely man-made, a small A-frame structure with a thatched roof. Inside I found some basic supplies, a tarp, water bottles, a few cans of food. Clearly someone had been camping out here, though it didn't look like they were currently around. As I continued my hike, I came across several more of these shelters scattered throughout the woods. They all had a similar construction and seemed to be stocked with survival gear. I started to get an uneasy feeling, wondering who would be building all these hidden camps deep in the forest. About an hour into my hike, I ran into another person on the trail, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard carrying a large backpack. He introduced himself as Ron and said he was practicing wilderness survival skills. When I mentioned the shelters, his eyes lit up and he eagerly told me all about how he had built them himself over the past few months. Ron seemed friendly enough, if a bit intense about his survival hobby. He talked at length about different shelter designs and how to live off the land. I nodded along politely, but something about him made me slightly uncomfortable. There was an odd glint in his eye that I couldn't quite place. After chatting for a few minutes, I made an excuse about needing to head back and said goodbye to Ron. As I walked away, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. When I glanced back, Ron was gone. I picked up my pace, wanting to get back to the main trail. The woods suddenly felt much darker and more ominous. Every snapping twig made me jump. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had come over me. About a mile from the trailhead, I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me. My heart started racing. I whirled around, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. Taking a deep breath, I broke into a run. I didn't stop until I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ron's face and those makeshift shelters hidden in the woods. I tried to convince myself that he was just an eccentric outdoorsman, but something felt very wrong. The next morning, I woke up to the news that 2 bodies had been found in Stevens Creek. My blood ran cold as I read the details. They were discovered in one of the shelters I had come across, strangled and posed in grotesque positions. I immediately called the police and told them everything I knew about Ron and the shelters. They took my statement and asked me to come in to look at some photos. When I arrived at the station, they showed me a series of mugshots. My stomach dropped as I recognized Ron's face among them. But the name listed wasn't Ron. It was Gerald Hoffman, a convicted murderer who had escaped from prison 6 months earlier. The realization of how close I had come to danger hit me like a punch to the gut. If I had lingered just a bit longer chatting with Ron that day, I could have easily become his next victim. The police assured me they were doing everything they could to track him down, but he seemed to have vanished into the wilderness. In the weeks that followed, I was plagued by anxiety and insomnia. Every sound outside my window made me jump. I kept replaying that day over and over, thinking of all the what-ifs. What if I had explored one of those shelters more thoroughly and stumbled upon him? What if he had decided to follow me all the way back to my car? I haven't been back to Stevens Creek since that day. I can't bring myself to set foot on those trails again. The thought of those hidden shelters scattered through the woods makes my skin crawl. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for his next victim to wander by. The police never found Gerald Hoffman. The case went cold after a few months with no new leads, but I still check the news regularly, dreading the day I might see his face again. I know the odds are slim that he's still in the area, but I can't shake the feeling that he's watching me. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear footsteps outside my house. I've tried to move on with my life, but that day changed me forever. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid of who might be lurking just out of sight. The woods I once found so peaceful now fill me with terror. I keep wondering about those poor victims and how many others may have crossed paths with Gerald without realizing the danger they were in. Rationally, I know the chances of running into another murderer in the woods are incredibly low, but the experience shattered my sense of safety and trust in strangers. I can't help but analyze every person I meet, looking for hidden motives or signs of danger. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, certain that Gerald is standing over my bed. In my nightmares, I'm back on that trail, running desperately as footsteps crash through the underbrush behind me. I always wake up just as a hand grabs my shoulder. I know I should probably see a therapist to work through this trauma, but I'm afraid of sounding crazy. How do I explain the lingering terror I feel, months after a chance encounter in the woods? So I keep it bottled up, putting on a brave face for my friends and family while battling my demons in private. Writing this all out has been cathartic in a way. Maybe sharing my story will help me start to heal. But I don't think I'll ever forget that day at Stevens Creek, or the realization of how quickly an ordinary hike can turn into a nightmare. So if you're out exploring the wilderness, remember to trust your instincts. You never know what might be hiding just around the bend in the trail. I was Devin's co-driver back in '95 when everything went to hell. We'd been on the road together for about a year at that point, hauling freight cross-country. Devin was a good guy, quiet, dependable, always on time. Nothing about him ever seemed off or weird until that last trip. We picked up a load in Wichita headed for Phoenix. Pretty standard run we'd done plenty of times before. The first day went smooth. We made good time across Kansas and into Colorado. Devin took the first shift, and I caught some sleep in the back. When I woke up to take over driving that evening, something felt different. Devin was real jittery, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel and glancing around nervously. I figured maybe he'd had too much coffee or something, but when I asked if he was all right, he just mumbled, "Yeah, fine," and stared straight ahead. His eyes looked kinda glassy and unfocused. I tried to shake off the weird vibe as we switched seats. Devin climbed in back, but I could hear him tossing and turning instead of sleeping. Every so often he'd mutter something I couldn't make out. I kept glancing in the mirror, getting more and more uneasy. We crossed into New Mexico around midnight. That's when things really started going sideways. Devin suddenly sat bolt upright and yelled, "Stop the truck!" I nearly had a heart attack. I pulled over onto the shoulder and Devin went scrambling out of the cab before we'd even fully stopped. He ran out into the desert, stumbling in the darkness. I called after him, but he didn't respond. I grabbed a flashlight and followed, worried he was having some kind of medical emergency. When I caught up, he was on his knees, clawing at the dirt and mumbling. "Devin, what the hell are you doing, man?" I said, shining the light on him. He looked up at me with this crazed expression I'll never forget. His pupils were huge, like black pools. "They're coming," he whispered. "We have to hide. They'll find us if we don't hide." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's coming?" "Devin, there's nobody out here. Let's get back to the truck." He shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. I can hear them. We need to go. Now." I managed to coax him back to the truck, but he was like a different person. Kept insisting we needed to change course, take back roads to avoid them. I was seriously freaked out at this point, wondering if he was having some kind of psychotic break. But we were in the middle of nowhere. All I could do was keep driving and hope to find a hospital or something. As we continued west, Devin got more and more agitated. He'd alternate between complete silence and frantic outbursts. Around 4 a.m. we crossed into Arizona. That's when Devon really lost it. "Turn here!" he suddenly screamed, grabbing the wheel. We swerved violently onto a small dirt road leading into thick forest. I fought to regain control as we bounced and skidded down the bumpy track. "Devon, stop! You're gonna get us killed," I yelled. But he was in some kind of frenzy, trying to wrestle the wheel away from me. We careened deeper into the woods until finally the truck slammed into a tree. The impact knocked the wind out of me. When I came to my senses a few seconds later, Devon was gone. The passenger door was open, and I could hear crashing sounds in the underbrush, like someone running full tilt through the forest. My head was spinning as I stumbled out of the cab. Dawn was just starting to break, casting weird shadows through the trees. I shouted for Devon but got no response. I was scared to leave the truck, but also terrified of what might happen to him out there in his state. I grabbed the flashlight and first aid kit and started searching. The woods were thick and disorienting. I'd catch glimpses of movement or hear something that sounded like footsteps, but every time I'd head that way, I'd find nothing. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted Devon in a small clearing ahead. He was on his knees again, rocking back and forth. As I got closer, I realized with horror that he was covered in blood. "Oh God, Devon, are you hurt?" I ran towards him but stopped short when he looked up at me. His eyes were completely blank, like there was nothing behind them anymore, and he was smiling, this eerie, vacant smile that made my skin crawl. "They're here," he said in a sing-song voice. "Can't you see them, all around us?" I glanced around nervously but saw nothing but trees and shadows. "Devon, you're hurt. We need to get you help." I reached out to him, but he suddenly sprang to his feet with unnatural speed. "No!" he snarled, his face contorting. "You're one of them. Stay back." Before I could react, he bolted into the woods again. I tried to follow, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. I searched for hours, getting more and more lost and desperate. Finally, as the sun was setting, I managed to find my way back to the truck. I called for help on the radio, and within a couple hours, police and search and rescue teams arrived. They scoured those woods for days, but never found a trace of Devon. It was like he'd been swallowed up by the forest. I was questioned extensively, of course. They thought maybe I'd done something to him at first, but eventually they seemed to accept my story, bizarre as it was. There was no evidence of foul play, and Devon's blood was found at the scene where I'd last seen him. For 2 years, it remained a complete mystery. Then a hiker found a human skull about 10 miles from where Devon vanished. DNA confirmed it was him. But there were no other remains, no clothing, nothing to explain what happened. It's been over 25 years now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've racked my brain trying to make sense of it. Did he have some underlying mental illness that suddenly manifested? Did he take some kind of drug that caused a psychotic break? Or was there really something out there in those woods that only he could see? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that the Devon I knew ceased to exist that night, replaced by something I still can't explain. Whatever happened out there in the Arizona wilderness, it was beyond anything I could have imagined, and a part of me is glad I never found out the whole truth. Still can't believe what happened to me last summer at my family's old cabin in the mountains. I've been trying to make sense of it for months, but I just can't wrap my head around it. Maybe writing it all down will help me process it. I don't know. It was supposed to be a quiet, relaxing summer. I had just finished my junior year of college, and was looking forward to some time alone to decompress before senior year. My parents offered to let me stay at our family cabin for a few months to look after the place. It seemed perfect. Peaceful mountain air, gorgeous views, and plenty of time to catch up on reading and hiking with my dog Roscoe. The first couple weeks were great. I settled into a nice routine of morning hikes with Roscoe, afternoons reading on the porch, and evenings cooking simple meals and watching the sunset. The isolation was exactly what I needed after a stressful year. But then things started to get weird. It was little things at first. I'd come back from a hike to find objects moved around inside, a book on a different shelf, a mug in the sink I was sure I'd left on the coffee table. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness at first. Then one night I woke up to some strange noises outside. It sounded like something large moving around, snapping twigs and rustling leaves. I figured it was probably just a deer or something and tried to go back to sleep. But Roscoe was on high alert, his ears perked up and a low growl in his throat. That dog has always had great instincts, so his reaction made me uneasy. The next morning I found some odd tracks in the mud near the cabin. They looked almost like bear prints, but not quite right somehow. Too large, with a strange shape to them. I tried to push my unease aside and go about my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, things escalated quickly. I was in the kitchen making a big pot of beef stew, comfort food to calm my nerves. Suddenly I heard a loud bang from the front of the cabin. Roscoe started barking like crazy. I grabbed a kitchen knife and cautiously went to investigate. The front door was wide open, banging in the wind. But I know for a fact I'd locked it earlier. As I approached to close it, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows beyond the porch. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and seemed to be covered in dark fur. Before I could get a better look, it vanished into the trees. Completely freaked out, I slammed and locked the door, then did a thorough check of the whole cabin. Nothing else seemed disturbed. I tried to convince myself I was just seeing things, that my imagination was running wild. I went back to the kitchen to finish making dinner, my hands shaking as I stirred the stew. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of the back door creaking open. My blood ran cold. I spun around to see an enormous, furry arm reaching into the kitchen. Before I could react, it grabbed the entire pot of stew off the stove and retreated. I caught another glimpse of the creature as it lumbered off the back porch, massively tall and broad, covered in shaggy dark fur, with unnaturally long arms. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in shock. Roscoe's frantic barking snapped me back to reality. I grabbed my phone and the kitchen knife and ran to lock myself in the bedroom. With shaking hands, I tried to call for help, but of course there was no cell service. The landline was in the living room, and there was no way in hell I was going back out there. I spent a terrifying night huddled in the bedroom with Roscoe, listening to heavy footsteps and strange grunting noises outside. Sometimes it sounded like the creature was right outside the window. Other times it seemed to be circling the cabin. I clutched the knife and prayed for morning to come. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I made a break for my car. I threw some clothes and supplies in a bag, grabbed Roscoe, and sprinted outside. The creature was nowhere in sight, but I could see massive muddy footprints all around the cabin. My car was covered in long, deep scratches. I peeled out of there as fast as I could. About a mile down the mountain road, I had to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting a fallen tree blocking the way. As I sat there trying to figure out what to do, I heard a bone-chilling roar from the woods beside the road. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature emerge from the tree line. Panic overtook me. I gunned the engine and drove right over the fallen tree, scraping the hell out of the undercarriage but somehow making it over. I flew down that mountain road at breakneck speed, taking turns way too fast, expecting at any moment to see the monster appear in front of me. Somehow, I made it to town in one piece. I went straight to the sheriff's office, but of course they didn't believe my wild story. They assumed I was on drugs or having some kind of mental breakdown. After determining I wasn't an immediate danger to myself or others, they basically told me to go sleep it off. I checked into a motel, feeling simultaneously exhausted and amped up on adrenaline. I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The next day, I reluctantly agreed to lead a couple deputies up to the cabin to investigate. I was terrified of going back, but I needed answers. When we got there, the place was a mess. Furniture overturned, claw marks on the walls, my stuff strewn everywhere. But there was no sign of the creature itself. The cops were baffled. They took some photos and samples, but ultimately concluded it must have been a bear break-in, albeit a weird one. They clearly thought I had panicked and blown things out of proportion. I knew what I saw wasn't a damn bear, but I couldn't prove otherwise. I grabbed the rest of my belongings and got the hell out of there. I've been staying with my parents ever since, trying to process what happened. I can't sleep without nightmares. Every unexplained noise sends me into a panic. Roscoe has been sticking to me like glue. I think he's traumatized too. I've done tons of research trying to figure out what that thing could have been. Bigfoot, some unknown cryptid, an escaped exotic animal. Nothing quite fits. I've gone back and forth between thinking I'm crazy and being absolutely certain of what I experienced. All I know is I'm never going back to that cabin again. Whatever that creature was, it made it clear that humans aren't welcome in its territory. I just hope no one else has to go through what I did. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in the woods again. It all started when my buddy Jake called me in a panic. He was supposed to be the camera operator for this Discovery Channel doc, but he'd come down with a nasty case of food poisoning. The crew was set to leave in 2 days, and they desperately needed a replacement. I had some experience filming in extreme conditions, so Jake recommended me. The pay was good, and I figured it would be an interesting adventure, so I agreed. 48 hours later, I was on a plane to Kathmandu with a group of strangers. There was Rob, the presenter, a typical TV personality type with perfect hair and teeth. Willie was the other cameraman, a gruff veteran who'd been on tons of these shoots. Karen was our harried producer, constantly on her satellite phone trying to smooth over logistics. And then there was Haresh, our local guide. He was a short, wiry Nepali man with a perpetual grin, despite the fact that he chain-smoked like a chimney. After a day of prepping gear in Kathmandu, we set out in a couple of beat-up land cruisers toward the mountains. The plan was to spend 2 weeks trekking through remote villages, interviewing locals about Yeti sightings, and hopefully catching some atmospheric shots of the misty peaks. Pretty standard stuff for a cryptozoology doc. The first few days were uneventful. We'd hike for hours, set up camp, film some scenery, then do it all again the next day. Rob would do his pieces to camera, talking about the history of Yeti myths. Willie and I captured B-roll of the spectacular landscape. Karen stressed about schedules and budgets. Harish smoked and smiled. It was on day 5 that things started to get weird. We'd made camp near the base of a sheer cliff face. That evening, Harish came to us looking unusually serious. He said there was a system of caves nearby that the locals avoided. According to him, strange noises sometimes echoed from the caves at night, and animals refused to go near them. Rob's eyes lit up at this. It was exactly the kind of spooky local lore the producers wanted. The next morning, we hiked to the cave entrance. It was an imposing sight, a dark moor in the rock face, with icy stalactites hanging like teeth. As we set up lights and cameras, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something about this place felt wrong. Rob did his intro spiel, and we began to make our way into the cave. The passage twisted and turned, forcing us to crouch and squeeze through narrow gaps. After about 15 minutes, the tunnel opened into a larger cavern, and that's when we heard it, a low moan echoing off the walls. We all froze. Rob whispered for us to keep rolling. Harish muttered something in Nepali that sounded like a prayer. The moan came again, louder this time. It sounded almost human. Cautiously, we moved deeper into the cavern. Our lights swept across the rocky floor and then suddenly illuminated a crumpled form. It was a man. He was curled up in a fetal position, shivering violently. His clothes were torn and filthy, his beard wild and matted. Karen rushed to him, asking if he was okay. The man's eyes were wild with fear as he looked up at us. He started babbling in French. Luckily, Karen spoke some French and was able to communicate with him. His name was Jean-Pierre. He claimed to be part of a geological survey team that had been exploring the cave system 2 weeks earlier. They'd gotten separated, and he'd been lost ever since. But that wasn't the worst of it. Jean-Pierre said there was something else in the caves, something huge and terrifying that had attacked his team. We were all shaken by this. Was it just the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation, or could there be some truth to it? Harish looked especially uncomfortable. He kept glancing nervously at the darker recesses of the cavern. We decided to get Jean-Pierre out of there immediately. Willie and I helped carry him as we retraced our steps through the twisting tunnels. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Just as we neared the cave entrance, a blood-curdling screech erupted from behind us. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part roar, part howl. The sound bounced off the cave walls, amplifying it to a deafening level. We all ran, dragging Jean-Pierre with us. We burst out of the cave into the sunlight, gasping for breath. That's when we saw it. About 50 yards away, a group of rhesus macaques were foraging on the hillside. Suddenly, a massive shape burst from the tree line. It was a blur of gray fur and long limbs. Before we could even process what was happening, it had snatched one of the monkeys. The creature turned, and for a split second, I saw it clearly. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy fur. Its face was almost human-like, but with a pronounced brow and huge, gleaming eyes. Then it was gone, disappearing back into the forest with its prey. We all stood there in stunned silence. Had we really just seen a yeti? It seemed impossible, but we'd all witnessed it. Jean-Pierre was sobbing, muttering, "C'est ça, c'est la créature," over and over. The rest of the expedition was a blur. We got Jean-Pierre to a hospital in the nearest town. Rob was beside himself with excitement, already envisioning the headlines our footage would generate. But Karen was on the satellite phone for hours, talking to the Discovery Channel execs. When she finally emerged from her tent, her face was grim. The network was shutting down the production. All our footage was to be confiscated, and we were being sent home immediately. They cited safety concerns, but it was clear they were trying to bury the whole thing. On the flight back, Willie managed to sneak me a memory card. Insurance, he whispered. It contained some of the cave footage and a blurry shot of the creature attacking the monkey. I've kept it hidden ever since. It's been 3 months now, and I still have nightmares about what I saw in those mountains. The Discovery Channel has maintained complete silence about the expedition. I've tried contacting Jean-Pierre, but it's like he's vanished off the face of the earth. I don't know why they're covering this up. Maybe they don't think people are ready for the truth. Or maybe there are other forces at work, trying to keep the existence of these creatures secret. All I know is that what I saw was real, and somewhere in those remote mountains, something is out there, something that was never meant to be discovered. It all started back in the late 1980s when I was stationed near Algonquin Provincial Park for a training exercise. We were up in the mountains, practicing wilderness survival skills in the dense forest. It was a crisp autumn night, and I was on watch duty while the rest of my unit slept. The air was still, almost unnaturally quiet. I remember feeling on edge, like something wasn't quite right. That's when I first heard it. A low, guttural sound that seemed to echo through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a bear or maybe a moose, but as I listened more closely, I realized it sounded almost human-like, but not quite. I gripped my rifle tighter, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The sound came again, louder this time, and I could swear it sounded like words, but in no language I'd ever heard before. It was deep and resonant, with a quality that sent chills down my spine. I woke up my commanding officer, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported what I'd heard. He listened for a few minutes, but by then, whatever had made the sound was gone. He chalked it up to my imagination and the stress of the training exercise, but I knew what I'd heard was real. That incident stayed with me, but I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe it was just the wind or some animal I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. Years passed, and I had almost managed to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, in the early 2000s, I was deployed on a mission in Alberta. We were doing some routine patrols in a heavily forested area, miles from the nearest town. My partner and I were scouting ahead of the main group when we heard a commotion in the underbrush. We froze, weapons at the ready, expecting to see a bear or maybe some poachers. What we saw instead will stay with me for the rest of my life. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. At first, I thought it might be a grizzly standing on its hind legs, but then it turned, and I saw its face. It was almost human, but not quite. The brow was heavy, the jaw pronounced, but the eyes were intelligent, aware in a way that no animal's eyes should be. Before we could react, a deer burst from the bushes, running for its life. The creature, I still can't bring myself to call it Sasquatch, even though that's clearly what it was, moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. In 2 strides, it caught up to the deer, grabbed it with hands that looked disturbingly human, and I can barely bring myself to describe what happened next. The sound of bones crushing and flesh tearing filled the air. In seconds, mere seconds, the deer was gone, consumed by this monstrous being. The strength, the brutality of it. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. My partner and I stood there, frozen in shock and terror. The creature turned its head towards us, and for a moment, our eyes met. I saw recognition there, an intelligence that chilled me to my core. It knew we were there, it knew we had seen it, and it was deciding what to do about us. In that moment, I was certain we were going to die. My finger tightened on the trigger of my rifle, but I knew it would be useless against something like that. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished into the forest, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for its size. We reported the incident, of course, but who would believe us? Our commanding officers listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They probably thought we had seen a bear, or that the stress of the mission had gotten to us. But I know what I saw. Since that day, I've done a lot of research. I've read about other sightings, other encounters. Some of them sound a lot like what I experienced, but nothing quite matches the sheer terror of standing there, watching this impossible creature, and knowing that it was aware of us too. I've never gone camping again. I can't bring myself to enter the deep woods, knowing what might be out there. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that guttural, almost human voice from Algonquin in my dreams. And I wonder, how many other soldiers, hikers, or campers have encountered these beings and been too afraid to speak up? I'm sharing this now because I think people need to know. There's something out there in the Canadian wilderness, something that defies explanation. It's strong, it's fast, and it's intelligent. And if you ever find yourself in the deep woods and feel like something's watching you, trust that instinct, because you might just be right. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, there are days when I can hardly believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'll carry those memories with me for the rest of my life. If you're ever in the Canadian wilderness, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. It was spring break of 1988, and a group of us college kids decided to go camping near Round Lake. We were all excited for a fun getaway in nature, hiking, swimming, drinking around the campfire. You know, typical college stuff. God, we had no idea what we were in for. The first day started off great. We set up our tents, went for a hike, jumped in the frigid lake. As the sun started to set, my buddy Jake and I volunteered to gather more firewood. We wandered a little ways from camp, joking around and not paying much attention. That's when we saw it. At first I thought it was a bear, but it moved all wrong. It was hunched over on all fours, covered in dark fur. My brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Then it stood up on two legs, and I felt my blood run cold. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall. The face was flat and ape-like, but the eyes were terrifyingly intelligent. It stared right at us for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then it let out this bone-chilling howl and loped off into the woods. Jake and I stood there frozen. Did we really just see that? We debated telling the others, not wanting to freak everyone out, but we were pretty shaken up. Looking back, I wish we had packed up and left right then. Maybe we could have avoided the horror that was to come. As night fell, we all gathered around the campfire, drinking beers and telling stories. I kept glancing nervously into the darkness beyond our little circle of light. Every snapping twig made me jump. Around 11 p.m., Megan said she saw strange lights moving through the trees. We all laughed it off at first, northern lights or something. But then we all saw them, eerie, pulsing spheres of light, weaving between the pines. They seemed to be getting closer. That's when the noises started, low, guttural moans that made the hair on my neck stand up, piercing shrieks that sounded almost human, but not quite. We huddled closer to the fire, unsure what to do. Should we run? Where would we even go in the pitch-black forest? Suddenly, the woods around us erupted in a cacophony of howls and roars. It sounded like we were surrounded by dozens of creatures. In the flickering firelight, I saw dark shapes moving just beyond the tree line. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Then it stepped into view, an enormous, ape-like creature at least 11 feet tall. It was covered in thick, matted fur and had glowing red eyes. This was no man in a costume. The sheer size and presence of this thing defied explanation. It let out a roar that shook me to my very core. We all started screaming and scrambling to get away. In the chaos, I tripped and fell hard. As I struggled to get up, I found myself face to face with something else entirely, a gleaming silver humanoid figure. It was translucent, almost glowing, and its face, oh God, its face, just one giant unblinking eye. I could feel it boring into my soul. I scrambled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. None of this was possible. Yet here I was, surrounded by monsters straight out of my worst nightmares. The night dissolved into a blur of terror after that, running blindly through the woods, glimpses of bizarre creatures, those awful, unearthly sounds echoing all around us. Somehow we all made it back to our cars and sped away, leaving all our gear behind. We drove for hours in stunned silence, each trying to process what we'd experienced. When the sun finally rose, it felt like waking up from a shared nightmare. But the scratches on our skin and the haunted looks in each other's eyes confirmed it was all too real. We made a pact not to talk about that night. Who would believe us anyway? But the memories never faded. For years I had terrible nightmares. I couldn't go camping or even for walks in the woods without panicking. Even now, decades later, I break out in a cold sweat thinking about it. What were those things? Where did they come from? I've read about Bigfoot sightings and alien encounters, but nothing comes close to the horrors we saw that night. Sometimes I wonder if we somehow stumbled into another dimension or reality, or if there are things lurking in the dark corners of our world that defy explanation. All I know is that night changed me forever. I no longer feel safe in the darkness, and I'll never step foot in those mountains again as long as I live. I'm sorry if this story seems disjointed or hard to believe. Honestly, I still struggle to make sense of it all myself, but I swear every word is true. I only hope that by sharing this, I can finally start to heal from the trauma, and maybe warn others to be careful out there. You never know what's hiding just beyond the light of your campfire. It started on what seemed like a normal day. My mom had packed my lunch as usual, but she'd run out of regular milk and put a carton of soy milk in instead. No big deal, right? Wrong. So wrong. When lunchtime came around, I pulled out my lunchbox and set everything up on my little desk like we always did. The teacher, Ms. Yamamoto, started walking around, checking everyone's lunches. I didn't think anything of it until she got to me. She stopped and stared at my soy milk carton with this look of pure rage on her face. "What is this?" she demanded, snatching up the carton. I was confused. "It's my milk," I said. "No, it's not," she hissed. "This is soy milk. You were supposed to bring regular milk." My stomach dropped. I tried to explain that my mom had packed it, that we were out of regular milk. But Ms. Yamamoto wasn't having any of it. "You're lying," she said, her voice ice cold. "We do not tolerate lying in this classroom." Before I knew what was happening, she grabbed me by the arm and yanked me to the front of the room. My classmates all stared wide-eyed as she forced me to stand facing them. "This boy is a liar," she announced to the class. "He tried to deceive us all with his soy milk. Lying will not be tolerated." I started crying, completely overwhelmed and scared. I kept trying to explain through my sobs that I wasn't lying, that it was just a mistake, but that only made her angrier. She stormed over to her desk and pulled out a small container. When she opened it, I saw it was full of thumbtacks. My blood ran cold as she plucked one out and held it up. "Since you insist on lying, you leave me no choice," she said. In one swift motion, she pinched my nose and jammed the thumbtack right into my nostril. The pain was excruciating. I screamed and tried to pull away, but she held me firmly in place. "This is what happens to liars," she said to the class as I wailed in agony. "Let this be a lesson to you all." But she wasn't done. She pulled out another thumbtack and held it in front of my face. "Open your mouth," she ordered. I shook my head, clamping my lips shut. She grabbed my jaw, squeezing painfully. "Open it now, or I'll make sure you never set foot in this school again. Your parents will be so ashamed of you." Terrified and in pain, I reluctantly opened my mouth. She placed the thumbtack on my tongue. "Swallow it," she commanded. I hesitated, and she slapped me hard across the face. "Swallow it now." Sobbing uncontrollably, I did as she said. I felt the sharp metal scrape my throat as it went down. The whole class watched in horrified silence. "Now go back to your seat and finish your lunch," she said coldly. "And don't you dare try to remove that thumbtack from your nose." I stumbled back to my desk, blood trickling from my nostril, my throat burning. I couldn't eat a thing. I just sat there, numb with shock and pain, as my classmates ate in uncomfortable silence. When the school day finally ended, I ran out as fast as I could. I didn't even wait for my mom. I just ran all the way home, my backpack bouncing against me. As soon as I burst through the front door, I collapsed on the floor, hysterical. My mom found me like that, and she freaked out when she saw the blood and the thumbtack still lodged in my nose. She carefully removed it and cleaned me up, demanding to know what happened. But I was so traumatized I could barely speak. She called the school immediately, absolutely livid. I don't know exactly what was said, but there was a lot of yelling. The next day, Ms. Yamamoto wasn't there. We had a substitute teacher who was much kinder. I never saw Ms. Yamamoto again after that. I heard rumors that she'd been fired, but no one ever really explained what happened to us kids. My mom wanted to press charges, but ultimately decided against it. She didn't want to put me through more trauma by making me relive it all. The physical wounds healed, but the emotional scars ran deep. For years after, I had nightmares about thumbtacks. I developed a phobia of them that I still struggle with today. Any time I see one, my heart starts racing and I break out in a cold sweat. It took me a long time to trust teachers again. I became withdrawn at school, afraid to speak up or draw attention to myself. The fear of being accused of lying or making a mistake paralyzed me. As I got older and realized just how fucked up the whole thing was, I got angry. Angry at Ms. Yamamoto for her cruelty. Angry at the school for allowing such abuse. Angry at the system that prioritized blind obedience over a child's well-being. I've been in therapy for years trying to process it all. It's helped, but I don't think I'll ever fully get over what happened. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom pain of that thumbtack in my nose feeling all too real. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe it's because I'm finally at a point where I can talk about it without completely falling apart. Maybe it's because I want people to know that this kind of abuse happens, even in places you'd least expect it. Whatever the reason, it feels good to finally get it out. If you've made it this far, thank you for reading. And if you're a teacher or work with kids, please, please be kind. You never know what kind of impact you'll have on a young life. Began with a letter. Just a simple white envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "I've been watching you. You're beautiful." At first I brushed it off as a prank or maybe a weird mistake, but then another letter came the next week, and another. They started getting more detailed, mentioning specific outfits I had worn or places I had been. It was terrifying to realize someone was actually following me. I went to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without any threats or crimes being committed. They told me to be vigilant and document everything. So that's what I did. I started keeping all the letters and taking photos of anything suspicious. Things escalated when concert tickets started showing up with the letters. Always for shows I had mentioned wanting to see to friends or on social media. It was like this person was in my head. I never went to any of the concerts, of course, but it freaked me out that they knew my tastes so well. I couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to move. I found a new apartment in Yokohama and didn't tell anyone but my closest friends and family. For a blissful month, the letters stopped. I started to relax, thinking maybe it was over. But then they started again. Somehow this person had found me. The content of the letters got darker. They talked about us being destined to be together and how no one else could ever love me like they did. I was terrified to leave my apartment. I installed security cameras and alarms. My fiancé was supportive at first, but the stress started to take a toll on our relationship. He couldn't understand why I was so paranoid all the time. I moved again, this time to Saitama. And again, they found me. By this point, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. My work started to suffer, and my boss pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay. I couldn't bring myself to explain the situation, so I just nodded and said I was fine. The breaking point came about 6 months ago. I was at Shinjuku Station, waiting for my train to work. As I stood on the platform, I felt someone staring at me. I turned and locked eyes with a man about 20 feet away. He smiled, and I knew instantly it was him, my stalker. I panicked and started running. He called out my name and began chasing me. I weaved through the crowded station, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him getting closer. As I burst out onto the street, I didn't even look before crossing. I heard tires screeching and turned to see my stalker get hit by a car that had swerved to avoid me. Everything after that is a blur. There were police and ambulances. I was questioned for hours. They told me the man had survived but was in critical condition. I should have felt relieved, but I was just numb. The aftermath has been devastating. My fiancé couldn't handle the stress and broke off our engagement. I had to resign from my job because I couldn't focus or feel safe commuting every day. I moved back in with my parents in Osaka, but I still jump at every sound and struggle to trust anyone. The police say the man who was hit was indeed my stalker. They found hundreds of photos of me in his apartment, along with shrine-like displays of things he had stolen from me. Hairbrushes, discarded receipts, even half-eaten food from my trash. It makes me sick to think about. He's in prison now, but I still don't feel safe. I keep wondering if he had accomplices or if someone else will pick up where he left off. I've been seeing a therapist, but the trauma runs deep. Some days I can barely bring myself to leave the house. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Trust your instincts if something feels off. Document everything, and don't be afraid to ask for help. I wish I had taken it more seriously from the beginning. Maybe things would have turned out differently. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from this experience. The feeling of being watched, of having my privacy so completely violated, it haunts me. I've lost so much, my job, my relationship, my sense of security. But I'm trying to rebuild, one day at a time. If anyone else has gone through something similar, know that you're not alone. We can get through this. For now, I'm focusing on healing, and trying to reclaim my life. But part of me wonders if I'll ever truly feel safe again. The scars left by my stalker run deep, and I'm not sure they'll ever fully fade. All I can do is keep moving forward and hope that someday this will all feel like a distant nightmare. The day started like any other hiking day. I woke up early, packed my backpack with essentials, and set off just as the sun was rising. The air was crisp, and the mountains were shrouded in a light mist that gave everything an ethereal quality. I felt alive and invigorated as I began my ascent. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The trail was challenging but manageable, and the views were breathtaking. I stopped occasionally to take photos and catch my breath, feeling grateful for the solitude and beauty surrounding me. As I ventured deeper into the mountains, the trail became less defined. I consulted my map and GPS frequently, making sure I was still on the right path. The dense forest seemed to close in around me, and I noticed the bird songs that had accompanied me earlier had faded away. An eerie silence settled over the area, broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was early afternoon when I decided to take a break and refill my water bottle. I could hear the faint sound of running water nearby and decided to seek out the source. Following the sound, I pushed through some thick underbrush and found myself at the edge of a small clearing with a river running through it. That's when I saw them. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. In the middle of the river, partially submerged in the gently flowing water, were 4 figures. They weren't moving, and as I cautiously approached, my blood ran cold as I realized what they were. Mannequins. 2 adults and 2 children, positioned in an unnaturally lifelike manner. They were facing upstream, their blank faces staring into the distance. The way they were placed made it look like a family outing gone horribly wrong. I felt my heart racing as I took in the disturbing scene before me. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The mannequins were covered in what looked like bullet holes. Dark, circular marks peppered their pale forms, stark against the white plastic. But what really sent a chill down my spine was the box cutter blade protruding from one of the child mannequins' back. I stood there, frozen in shock and disbelief. Who would do this? Why here, in the middle of nowhere? The questions swirled in my mind as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to take pictures. I needed proof. I needed to show someone what I had found. But as I raised my phone, I heard a twig snap somewhere in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. The dense foliage revealed nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I turned back to the river, half expecting the mannequins to have disappeared or moved. But they were still there, silent and motionless in the gently flowing water. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I needed to document this. I needed to report it to someone. With trembling hands, I managed to take a few photos. The images on my screen looked surreal, like something out of a horror movie. But this was real. This was happening right in front of me. As I lowered my phone, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was writing on the chest of one of the adult mannequins. I squinted, trying to make out the faded characters. It looked like Japanese, but I couldn't read it from where I stood. Against my better judgment, I decided to wade into the river for a closer look. The water was ice cold, numbing my feet as I carefully made my way towards the mannequins. The closer I got, the more unsettling they became. Their blank eyes seemed to follow me, and I could swear I saw one of the child mannequin's hands twitch. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I focused on the writing, now close enough to read it. The characters were crudely etched into the plastic. Sitachi wo hyutsude, save us. A chill ran through my body that had nothing to do with the cold water. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the slippery riverbed. As I regained my balance, I heard another sound from the forest. This time, it was unmistakably footsteps. Panic gripped me. I splashed out of the river as fast as I could, not caring about the water soaking my clothes. I grabbed my backpack and started running back the way I came, my wet shoes squelching with each step. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Only then did I slow down, gasping for air as I leaned against a tree. I looked back, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing me. But there was nothing except the quiet forest. As my breathing steadied, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all a hallucination, some strange effect of altitude and exhaustion. But the photos on my phone proved otherwise. The mannequins were real, and someone had put them there for a reason. I spent the rest of the hike constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. When I finally made it back to civilization, I went straight to the local police station. The officers listened to my story with skeptical expressions, but they took down my report and copied the photos from my phone. They promised to investigate, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. To them, it was probably just some elaborate prank or art installation, but I knew better. The fear I felt, the eerie silence of the forest, the inexplicable writing on the mannequin. It was all too real. It's been months since that day, and I still can't shake the memory of what I saw. I've tried researching similar incidents, looking for any explanation that might make sense, but I've found nothing. The police never followed up, and when I called to ask about the investigation, they said they found nothing at the site. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at the photos on my phone. The mannequins stand there, frozen in time, their bullet-riddled bodies a silent testament to something I can't understand. And every time I look at them, I swear their positions have changed ever so slightly. I haven't been hiking since that day. The mountains that once brought me peace now fill me with dread. I can't help but wonder, what if I had arrived earlier or later? What if I had stayed longer? What if I had tried to move the mannequins? These questions haunt me, along with the memory of those blank faces staring up at me from the river. I don't know if I'll ever find answers, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget the day I stumbled upon the mountain mannequin mystery. And somewhere out there, in the depths of those mountains, I fear those mannequins are still waiting, silently pleading for someone to save them from whatever nightmare they're trapped in. It was a typical Friday night. My buddy Jake and I had just finished our shift at the docks and decided to grab a few beers before heading home. We ended up losing track of time at our favorite dive bar, and by the time we left, it was well past midnight. Jake suggested we take a drive down to the Old Wharf area. It was a spot we used to hang out at when we were younger, smoking cigarettes and watching the boats come in. I was feeling nostalgic, so I agreed. The drive was quiet, the roads were empty, and a light fog had settled over the city. As we approached the wharf, I noticed how eerily silent it was. Usually, there'd be at least a few night fishermen or early morning workers milling about, but tonight, it was like a ghost town. We parked near the edge of the pier and got out to stretch our legs. The salty air hit my face, and for a moment I felt at peace. But that feeling didn't last long. As we were leaning against my car, headlights suddenly appeared in the distance. A beat-up minivan slowly made its way down the road towards us. Something about it immediately set me on edge. Maybe it was the way it was crawling along, or the fact that its headlights were dimmed, but my gut was screaming that something wasn't right. Jake must have sensed it too, because he whispered, "Dude, let's get back in the car." But before we could move, the van pulled up about 20 feet away from us and stopped. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The engine idled, and we could see shadowy figures moving inside. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Suddenly, the side door slid open. In the dim light, I could make out 3 men inside. 2 of them seemed to be struggling with something, or someone, in the back seat. That's when I saw him. A young man, probably in his early 20s, was being held down by the other 2. His eyes were wide with terror, darting back and forth between us and his captors. But what really chilled me to the bone was the duct tape plastered across his mouth. Our eyes locked for a brief moment, and I swear I could feel his desperation. He was silently pleading for help, but I was paralyzed with fear. One of the men holding him down noticed us and barked something in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded like Japanese, but I couldn't be sure. The driver's window rolled down, and another man leaned out. He was older, with a face etched with scars and a piercing gaze that made my blood run cold. "You boys lost?" he asked in heavily accented English. His tone was casual, almost friendly, but there was an underlying threat that made my skin crawl. Jake, always quicker on his feet than me, managed to stammer out, No, sir, we were just leaving." The man's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Good. This is no place for young men like yourselves at night. Dangerous things happen here." I couldn't take my eyes off the young man in the back. He was still struggling, his muffled cries barely audible. The older man followed my gaze, and his expression darkened. "I suggest you forget what you've seen here tonight," he said, his voice now dripping with menace. "For your own safety, of course." I managed to nod, my throat too dry to speak. The man gave us one last warning look before rolling up his window. The side door slammed shut, cutting off our view of the captive man. As the van started to pull away, I caught one last glimpse of those terrified eyes through the back window. They haunted me for weeks afterward. Jake and I didn't say a word as we got back in my car and sped away from the wharf. We drove in silence, both of us too shocked to speak. It wasn't until we were nearly home that Jake finally broke the silence. "What the fuck just happened?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I shook my head, still trying to process it all. "I don't know, man, but I think we just witnessed something really bad." We debated calling the police, but what could we tell them? We had no proof, no license plate number, nothing concrete, and the warning from that scarred man kept echoing in my head. "Forget what you've seen here tonight." In the end, we decided to keep quiet. But the guilt has been eating away at me ever since. I can't help but wonder what happened to that young man. Did we condemn him by not acting? Could we have saved him if we'd been braver? I've been doing some research since that night, trying to make sense of what we saw. I've read about Yakuza activity in our area, about human trafficking rings operating out of the port. Every new piece of information I uncover makes me sick to my stomach, knowing we might have stumbled upon something much bigger and more sinister than we could have imagined. I've been back to the wharf a few times since then, always during the day, and never alone. I keep hoping to see something, anything, that might give me a clue about what really happened that night. But it's always just business as usual. Fishermen, dock workers, tourists. No sign of that beat-up minivan or its terrifying occupants. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the beers and the late hour played tricks on my mind. But then I remember those eyes, those pleading, desperate eyes, and I know it was all too real. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe it's the guilt, or maybe I'm hoping someone out there has experienced something similar. All I know is that I'll never forget that night at the wharf and the young man we left behind. If you're out there, wherever you are, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we didn't do more to help you. To anyone reading this, be careful out there. There are dark things happening in the shadows of our cities, things most of us never see or choose to ignore. And sometimes, when you least expect it, those shadows can reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined. I don't know if I'll ever find answers or closure for what happened that night, but I do know that I'll carry the weight of it with me for the rest of my life. The wharf, once a place of childhood nostalgia, is now forever tainted in my mind, a reminder of the night we glimpsed the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of our seemingly normal world. I still can't shake the feeling of unease when I think back to that day. It started off so normal, just like any other lazy Saturday afternoon. I had graduated from college a few months prior and was enjoying my newfound free time before starting my first real job. I decided to take a stroll through the local park to get some fresh air and clear my head. The weather was perfect, sunny but with a cool breeze. As I was walking along one of the winding paths, something bright red caught my eye. There, sitting on a bench, was a small red purse. I looked around but didn't see anyone nearby who could be the owner. I picked it up, thinking I'd turn it in to park security or the police station. It felt wrong to look inside, but I did a quick peek to see if there was any ID. No wallet or anything identifying, just some makeup, keys, and other random items. Not seeing any park staff around, I decided to drop it off at the police station on my way home. I tucked it into my backpack and continued on my walk. By the time I got home, I was exhausted from being out in the sun all afternoon. I completely forgot about the purse and left my backpack by the door, planning to deal with it later. A few hours passed as I lazed around my apartment, watching TV and scrolling on my phone. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I cautiously went to answer it. When I opened the door, I was stunned. Standing there was easily the most beautiful woman I had ever seen in real life. She looked like she had just stepped off a magazine cover. Flawless skin, piercing green eyes, and long dark hair. For a moment I just stared, completely caught off guard. "Hi there," she said with a dazzling smile. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I think you may have found my purse earlier." It took me a second to process what she was saying. How did she know I had found a purse? And how did she know where I lived? A chill ran down my spine as I realized how strange this was. "Oh, yeah, I did find a red purse in the park," I stammered. "I was planning to turn it into the police station." Her smile widened. "That's so kind of you. I'm so glad an honest person found it. Would it be all right if I came in to get it?" Every instinct was screaming at me that something wasn't right, but she seemed so friendly and normal. Plus, I reasoned, what were the odds of someone showing up pretending to have lost a purse? I reluctantly stepped aside to let her in. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the air in the room seemed to change. It felt heavier somehow, charged with an odd energy. She glided into my living room, moving with an unnatural grace. "So, where did you say you found it?" she asked, turning to face me. "In the park, on a bench near the pond," I replied. Her eyes bore into mine, and I felt almost dizzy. "Ah, yes, that's right. I remember now. Silly me being so forgetful." She laughed, but the sound was off somehow. Too perfect, like it was rehearsed. I went to grab my backpack, eager to give her the purse and get her out of my apartment. As I unzipped it, a thought struck me. "Wait, how did you know I had found your purse? And how did you know where I live?" I asked, my suspicion growing. For just a split second, her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, a friend of mine saw you pick it up and recognized you. Small world, isn't it?" That explanation made no sense. I had just moved to this city after graduation and barely knew anyone. There's no way some random person would have recognized me. I handed her the purse, trying to mask my unease. "Well, here you go. Glad I could return it to you." She took it, her fingers brushing against mine. Her touch was ice cold and sent a jolt through me. "Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver. I don't know what I would have done without my keys and everything." As she spoke, I noticed something odd. Her lips weren't quite syncing up with her words, almost like a badly dubbed movie. I blinked hard, convinced I must be seeing things. When I looked again, everything seemed normal. "Well, I should be going. Thanks again," she said, heading for the door. I breathed a sigh of relief as she left, but just before closing the door, she turned back to me with that unnervingly perfect smile. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again very soon." The door clicked shut, and I immediately locked it, my hands shaking. What the hell had just happened? The whole encounter felt surreal, like a dream. But the red purse was gone, proving it had been real. I tried to shake off my paranoia, telling myself I was overreacting. But I couldn't stop replaying every detail in my head. Her impossible beauty, the weird energy in the room, the way her words didn't match her lips. None of it added up. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump, convinced she had somehow gotten back into my apartment. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with her face, distorted and monstrous. The next day, I decided to go to the police station. I knew it would sound crazy, but I wanted to report the whole weird incident, just in case. Maybe they could check if any other strange encounters had been reported. As I approached the front desk, the officer looked up at me. "Can I help you?" "Yeah, I wanted to report a suspicious incident from yesterday," I said hesitantly. "A woman showed up at my apartment claiming I had found her purse, but something felt really off about the whole thing." The officer's brow furrowed. "Did you find a purse recently?" "Yes, in the park. I was planning to turn it in here, actually." He turned to his computer and typed for a moment. "We don't have any reports of a lost purse in the system. When did you find it?" "Yesterday afternoon around 2 p.m., I replied. He shook his head. "Nothing came in yesterday about a lost purse. Are you sure you didn't tell anyone else you found it?" A chill ran through me. "No, I didn't tell a soul. I came straight home, and then she showed up a few hours later somehow knowing I had it." The officer leaned forward, looking concerned. "Son, are you saying this woman knew you had found a purse without you telling anyone, and she knew where you lived?" I nodded, the full weight of how creepy it was hitting me. "Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And there was something really off about her. Too perfect looking, moving weird. Just gave me a really bad feeling." He took down all the details of my story, promising to look into it. But I could tell he was skeptical. Hell, I almost didn't believe it myself. As I left the station, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My blood ran cold as I read the message. "It was so nice meeting you yesterday. I do hope you're not causing any trouble. Remember, I said we'd be seeing each other again very soon." I nearly dropped my phone, looking around wildly. How did she get my number? How did she know I went to the police? For the next week, I was a nervous wreck. I barely left my apartment, jumping at every sound. I changed the locks and installed a security camera. But nothing happened. No more texts, no sign of the woman. Just when I had started to relax and convince myself it was all in my head, I saw her. I was at the grocery store turning down an aisle when there she was at the other end. That same impossible beauty, that same unsettling smile. She waved at me, then turned and walked away. I ran after her, determined to confront her and get answers. But when I rounded the corner, she was gone, vanished into thin air. It's been months now, and I still don't know what to make of it all. Was she some kind of scam artist? A hallucination? Something supernatural? I've racked my brain trying to make sense of it, but I'm no closer to answers. All I know is that I still feel watched. I still see flashes of red out of the corner of my eye. And I still wake up in a cold sweat, her words echoing in my mind. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again very soon. I still can't believe what happened to me. It's been years, but the memories of those 24 days still haunt me. I was only 9 years old when it all started, just a normal kid living in Dewsbury, West Yorkshire. That February day seemed like any other. I walked home from school, looking forward to watching some telly and playing with my siblings. But everything changed in an instant. As I was nearing our council estate, a van suddenly pulled up beside me. Before I could react, a man grabbed me and yanked me inside. I tried to scream, but he clamped his hand over my mouth. The van sped off as I struggled, terrified and confused. What was happening? Who was this man? Where were we going? The next thing I knew, I woke up groggy and disoriented in a dark, cramped space. My head was pounding, and I felt sick to my stomach. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was in some kind of hidden compartment under a bed. There was barely enough room to move. I started crying and shouting for help, pounding on the walls. But no one came. Hours passed, maybe days. I lost all sense of time in that tiny prison. Occasionally, the man would open the compartment and give me some food or water, or let me use the toilet. But mostly I was trapped in the darkness, scared and alone. I begged him to let me go home, to call my mum. He just told me to be quiet and that it would all be over soon. I didn't understand what was happening or why. Had I been kidnapped? Was my family looking for me? Would I ever see them again? The fear and uncertainty were overwhelming. I cried myself to sleep most nights, praying someone would find me. As time went on, I started to hear snippets of news reports and conversations. People were looking for me. There were searches and appeals on TV. But why hadn't they found me yet? Didn't they know where I was? Then one day, I heard a familiar voice. My mum. She was there, in the same flat where I was being held. My heart leapt with hope and relief. Surely she would rescue me now. But to my shock and confusion, she didn't. She talked to my captor like they knew each other. What was going on? I tried calling out to her, but the compartment was soundproof. I heard them discussing money and rewards. Slowly, the horrifying truth began to dawn on me. This wasn't a real kidnapping. My own mother had planned this. She had let this happen to me. The betrayal and heartbreak were almost worse than the fear. How could my mum do this to me? Didn't she love me? I felt so alone and abandoned. I started to lose hope that I'd ever be found or freed. But then, 24 days after I was taken, everything changed again. There was suddenly a commotion in the flat, shouting, doors being broken down. I heard unfamiliar voices, people searching, and then light flooded into my hiding place as the compartment was opened. I blinked up at the police officers, barely able to believe it was over. The next few hours were a blur. I was taken to the hospital, examined, questioned. Social workers and police officers asked me endless questions. Where had I been? What had happened? Did I know the man who took me? I was overwhelmed and confused, still processing the betrayal. As the full story came out in the following days and weeks, I struggled to comprehend it all. My mum and her boyfriend's uncle had orchestrated the whole thing. They had planned to collect reward money for my safe return. I had been drugged and hidden away while the nation searched for me. The media frenzy was intense. Reporters camped outside our house, shouting questions. I saw my face plastered across newspapers and TV. Everyone wanted to know how I was, what had happened. But how could I even begin to explain? I was just a little girl who had been through something awful. I didn't have the words. My mum and the others involved were arrested and eventually sent to prison. I was placed in foster care, separated from my siblings. My whole world had been turned upside down. I felt angry, hurt, and so very alone. How do you move on from something like that? How do you ever trust anyone again? It's been years now, but I still struggle with the aftermath. I have nightmares about being trapped in that tiny space. Loud noises make me jump. I find it hard to trust people or feel safe. The betrayal by my own mother left deep emotional scars that may never fully heal. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if it had never happened. Would I be a normal teenager now, hanging out with friends and dreaming about the future? Instead, I'm still trying to piece myself back together to find some sense of normalcy. I know my story shocked the nation. People couldn't believe a mother could do that to her own child. But for me, it wasn't a sensational news story. It was my life, my trauma. And I'm still living with the consequences every day. I'm sharing this now in hopes that it might help someone else who has been through something traumatic, to let them know they're not alone, that it's okay to still be struggling, to still be healing. Some days are harder than others, but I'm trying to move forward one day at a time. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why it happened or how someone could do that to their own child, but I'm determined not to let it define me forever. I'm more than just that kidnapped girl. I'm a survivor, and I'm still here, still fighting. And maybe someday I'll find real peace and healing. Until then, I'll keep sharing my story, hoping it makes a difference for someone else out there who feels alone and afraid. As we browsed through the tables of knickknacks and old clothes, Tommy's eyes lit up when he spotted a cardboard box filled with various toys, action figures, toy cars, building blocks, and even a small toy fort. The elderly woman running the sale noticed his excitement and told me I could have the whole box for just $10. It seemed like a great deal, so I handed over the cash and we headed home with Tommy's treasure trove. At first, everything seemed normal. Tommy was thrilled with his new toys and spent hours playing with them in his room that afternoon. I was just happy to see him so entertained. But that night, things took a strange turn. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard Tommy talking and laughing in his room. Figuring he was just playing, I didn't think much of it. But after about 20 minutes, I realized it sounded like he was having a full conversation. Curious, I went to check on him. When I opened his door, I found Tommy sitting inside the little toy fort, chattering away. But he was alone in the room. "Who are you talking to, buddy?" I asked. Tommy looked up at me with a big smile. "I'm talking to Billy. He's my new friend who lives in the fort." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked, "Billy? Is he imaginary?" Tommy shook his head. "No, silly. He's right here." He pointed to an empty spot next to him in the fort. "He says he used to own all these toys, but now he's sharing them with me. Isn't that nice of him?" I felt the blood drain from my face. Trying not to show my unease, I told Tommy it was bedtime and helped him clean up the toys. As I tucked him in, he sleepily said, "Billy says goodnight too, Mommy." I barely slept that night, my mind racing. The next morning over breakfast, I casually asked Tommy if he'd had any more chats with Billy. To my relief, he just shrugged and said no. I started to convince myself I had overreacted. Kids have imaginary friends all the time, right? But throughout the day, I kept catching Tommy whispering to himself as he played. At one point, I heard him say, "No, Billy, I don't want to play that game. It sounds scary." When I asked what game Billy wanted to play, Tommy just looked confused and said he didn't know what I was talking about. That evening, my husband Mark got home from his business trip. After Tommy went to bed, I told Mark about the strange happenings with the garage sale toys. He was skeptical at first, suggesting Tommy just had an overactive imagination. But then we heard a loud crash from upstairs. We raced to Tommy's room and found him standing in the middle of the floor, surrounded by scattered toys. The toy fort was upside down on the other side of the room. Tommy was crying hysterically. "Billy got mad," he sobbed. "He wanted me to play the knife game, but I said no, so he threw all the toys." Mark and I exchanged horrified looks. This was beyond a simple imaginary friend. Something was very wrong here. The next morning I went back to our neighbor's house, determined to get some answers about where these toys came from. The elderly woman seemed confused at first, then her face fell as realization dawned. "Oh dear," she said softly. "I completely forgot about that old box. It belonged to my grandson Billy. He passed away about 10 years ago. Such a tragedy." My heart was pounding as I pressed for more details. The story she told chilled me to the bone. Billy had been just 7 years old when his father lost his job and spiraled into a deep depression. One night, in a drug-fueled psychotic break, he murdered Billy and his mother before taking his own life. The toys in that box were the last things Billy had played with. I thanked the woman and rushed home, my mind reeling. When I told Mark what I'd learned, we knew we had to get rid of the toys immediately. But when we went to Tommy's room to gather them up, we were met with a horrifying sight. All the toys were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room. The toy fort was in the middle, and sitting inside it was one of Tommy's teddy bears, with a kitchen knife stuck through its chest. Tommy was huddled in the corner, shaking. "Billy did it," he whispered. "He's really mad now." We didn't waste another second. Mark scooped up Tommy while I quickly threw all the toys back in the cardboard box. We drove to a dumpster across town and tossed the whole thing in, my hands shaking the entire time. For weeks afterward, Tommy had terrible nightmares. He would wake up screaming about Billy coming to get him. We took him to a child psychologist who suggested the whole experience had simply traumatized him, but I'm not so sure. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear strange noises coming from Tommy's room, like the sound of toys moving around, and once I could have sworn I heard a child's laughter that didn't belong to my son. We've since moved to a new house, hoping for a fresh start. Tommy seems to be doing better now, but he refuses to play with any second-hand toys. As for me, I'll never look at a garage sale the same way again. You never know what kind of darkness might be lurking in those innocent-looking cardboard boxes. I still lie awake some nights, wondering if we really got rid of Billy, or if he somehow followed us to our new home. All I know is that I'll never forget the terror of those few days, and the realization that sometimes the most innocent things can hide the most sinister secrets.